and online, and to our later viewers, to this meeting on trade unionism and working class organisation. A topic that never goes away, but has particular resonance right now, when a year of trade union struggles seem to be ending in a ditch of extremely poor settlements, disgruntled memberships, leaderships who are selling defeats as victories, and it all being rounded up into a, well, let's put our faith in electing Labour at the next election to save the position of the working class, which in the meantime is sinking very fast and by the day. So, with that in mind, I'm going to lead straight to our first speaker. I'll just introduce very quickly who we've got with us today. We have Alex McKay from Red Star Radio, who has a lot of experience in the British trade union movement, as well as of an understanding of Marxism and class struggle. We have Victoire Bech from the Association Nationale des Communistes in France. That's National Association of Communist People. And she obviously comes from a communist organisation which is very involved in class struggles, trade union struggles in France. And we know, of course, that the French are famous in Britain for being much more militant than we are. We often look over the channel, those of us who are aware of what's happening, with envy and say, oh my goodness, if we had organisation like that, everything would be different here. So it will be interesting to get Victoire's take on what's actually happening in France and what are the similarities and differences between the British and French approach to trade union struggle. So with that as our introduction, I will hand over to Alex from Red Star Radio.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. Now, thank you, comrades, for the invitation to speak here today. I'm going to be speaking about the industrial issues that Jyoti touched on there in her introduction, and then move on to what I see and what we at the project I'm involved in, the Class Consciousness Project, see as the big barriers to class struggle in Britain today. So, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about the Class Consciousness Project, which I've been involved with since the beginning of the year. Myself and other comrades from London and the northwest of England founded this at the beginning of the year because we were looking at the situation that was developing with regard to the various different trade union struggles that have been ongoing since the middle point of 2022. And these looks to be declining away towards an inevitable sellout in the end. We could all see it developing through the various actions of the different union leaderships. And as it turns out, we were unfortunately correct about that. So what we did at the beginning of this year, we decided to bring a group of us together who, though some have slightly different political perspectives, some are involved in political organizations, some aren't, we decided that there had to be a project started that would learn from the best examples of trade unionism in the past. And that trade unionism, I mean, is the trade unionism that comes from the base of the unions, that comes from the workers themselves, organising in such a way as to be able to push past the bureaucratic resistance of the trade union leaders and, of course, the ever-present barrier to class struggle in Britain, and that is the Labour Party. And we look over our history, and we look back over 100 years to see examples of this that have inspired us, including the national minority movement of the 1920s and 1930s that was very much linked to the original Communist Party of Great Britain, and how this turned into a nightmare for the trade union leaders and the Labour Party of the time, because suddenly rank and file workers were not only organising at the base of the unions in defiance of the union leaders, but were educating themselves, were raising themselves through the process of struggle and collective education to a higher level of consciousness so that they were no longer prepared to put up with the excuses and the lies and the obfuscations of the trade union leaders. And we look back slightly closer in our history to the period of struggle that erupted in the late 1960s and ran through to the middle 1980s. You saw there leaders like Arthur Scargill and others coming through the ranks of what was then the National Union of Mine Workers to become a prominent national figure, then lead that union because of the organising at the rank and file level. And it was this strength of rank and file worker organisation that motivated and gave strength to a lot of the struggles that we are now famous in the early 1970s, such as Upper Clyde shipbuilders, the strength of the trade union struggles in the car industry, all of that, with all its limitations, and there were real limitations, came from the organised working class, the politically educated working class, the strong sense of class consciousness that terrified the employers and the government. And it was one of the motivating factors behind the later Thatcher government's decision to break up industries, destroy whole trade unions, and get to the point where they could reduce that level of class consciousness, to stamp it out, to atomize the working class so that that level of struggle could not reappear again for a generation. And as we sit here today, it is now over a generation since that last heroic struggle in the middle 1980s of the National Union of Mine Workers was brought to an unfortunate defeat, largely by not just the action of the state forces, but the lack of solidarity coming from the rest of the trade union movement. And the fact that so many trade union leaders were much happier to see the National Union of Mine Workers defeated than they would have been to see a victory. And that is something that remains true to this day. So when we started the project, that was our inspiration to try and do something to start an education process that was free of the bureaucratic inertia of the trade union education process. Now, I've been in the trade union movement for 20 years now, in various different trade unions. I've been in the Shop Workers Union, USDOR, which if you've ever been in it, you know how bad it is. It's stuck in a long-term loveless marriage to the Labour Party, which each side keeps recommitting to every year. I've been in my current union, Unite, for multiple occasions, but most of my time was spent in the Civil Servants Trade Union, Public and Commercial Services, which is a union that isn't linked to the Labour Party, but has all the disadvantages of being so. So what all of us came in the project came to the realisation of was that when the situation worsens in Britain, which it is worsening now, the class struggle is intensifying from the ruling class, who are really amping up or preparing to amp up their attacks on the working class. You can see this in a lot of what they're doing. You can see it, of course, most obviously in the gigantic profit made by a company like British Gas, when, of course, workers have been struggling to heat their homes over the past year. And you can see it also in the passing of the cost on of the many crises that have been present in British capitalism since 2008 to the working class. And there was a story just in the last week of how the multiple rounds of quantitative easing that have pumped billions into the banking system, well, that cost is going to be passed directly onto the working class through the form of another 150 billion the government has to provide to the Bank of England to make up for the losses on those programs of all the rotten assets they've bought up over the last 15 years. And that cost is going to be passed directly onto the working class. It's going to be passed on in the form of wage restraint, wage cuts, cuts to public services, the draining away of resources from many areas of the country. And that is the class war. We're told, of course, by bourgeois propaganda that you shouldn't fight a class war, but of course they're just saying that they want an unopposed class war. Whereas the class war from them is constant. It is all the time. It is in every aspect of our lives that the bourgeoisie wages its class war. And they only get angry when the working class gets strong enough and educated enough to actually launch an effective fight back. So these are the motivations behind us starting the Class Consciousness Project. Now, I want to talk to you today about the three big barriers as we see it as to waging an effective class struggle in Britain today. I think many of you may have observed them already. But the first and most obvious is the link to the Labour Party. Now, before I went into higher positions in the trade union movement, I wasn't fully aware of just how crippling this link is to actually the development of real struggle. And it isn't just crippling in the Labour-linked unions either. It's because the entire TUC is wedded to the Labour Party. It has a vested interest in making sure that any interesting struggle, any struggle that might go somewhere, that might lead workers to a higher level of consciousness, any of those struggles is immediately squashed, stifled, sold out, capitulated upon, because they fear the escalation of the struggle far more than they fear the government. You have to remember, the leaders of the trade union movement in Britain have a very nice niche for themselves. They have guaranteed access to the House of Lords at the end of a long and distinguished career of selling out every single struggle. You can get £300 a day to fall asleep soaked in wine on a red bench. Nice work if you're prepared to sell out absolutely everybody. And this is, of course, the serious point, is that the Labour Party's role here in squashing working class struggle, it isn't new. It isn't the case, as many Labour leftists say, that the party has lost its way. This is what it was set up to do. Over 120 years ago, it was set up not by the militant end of the working class, it was set up by the trade union bureaucracy and the middle-class socialist organisations like the Fabians, who essentially viewed the working class as, at best, objects of charity, not as the potential rulers of a new society. So the Labour Party, from its beginning, was there to manage class struggle. It was there to make sure it remained within acceptable boundaries. And in that, Keir Starmer is an exactly perfect successor to Ramsay MacDonald, to Harold Wilson, and to all of the other Labour leaders, including Saint Clement of Attlee, who they all swear that they love so much. Because the point is that there was no point where the Labour Party was an actual vessel for the struggle of workers. Whether you look at every single struggle that's been waged over the past century that meant anything, every single one of them the Labour Party's turned its back on at best, or actively suppressed if it's been in government. Look at the amount of strikes that the sainted Attlee government suppressed between 1945 and 1951. And that's leaving aside all of their brutal acts of imperialism, which were used to hyper-exploit the colonised peoples of the world in order to fund concessions to the British working class. Of course, nobody in the British left wants to talk about that, but I'll come back to that later. But the Labour Party link in this day and age is the severity of the stifling that it puts upon working class struggle is getting worse because the situation is getting worse. Because we are in a developing class war where the pressure from the ruling class is relentless, and the response of the working class is getting angrier, but it lacks the class lacks in general the level of political education, the level of class consciousness to actually wage a struggle against not only the employers and the government, but also against their own leaders, their own supposed leaders. Because if you look at what's happened with the so-called settlements that the Communication Workers Union has signed up to in the post office, in Royal Mail, if you look at what the National Education Union leaders have settled for, what the health union leaders are prepared to settle for, it's paltry, it's nothing. And one of the key reasons why is, of course, this Labour Party link, because the power of the Labour Party within that trade union bureaucracy is immense, and they lean on that to make sure that there's no disruption, especially as we get closer and closer to an election. All of those leaders, whether they're directly tied to the Labour Party or not, are going to keep suppressing struggle and keep pushing it down. So one of the key things that we have to agitate for in the movement is that we must secure disaffiliation from the Labour Party of all of our trade unions. And even if that takes us a year, takes us 2 years, or we have to wage that struggle continually, we have to take that message to trade union members up and down the country to let them know that not only is the Labour Party not acting in their interest, it is an active barrier to having their interests addressed, to having their class interests actually looked after. And it is something that many workers have an instinctive feeling for. They know very well that the Labour Party is not their friend. I'm not talking about the bureaucracy now. I'm talking the regular worker knows very well that the Labour Party is not his or her friend. But they lack the knowledge as to how to put that into a political programme of action. And that is what we must be prepared to do. Now, the other two factors I want to touch on here is that are barriers to class struggle that we must overcome is the role of the British left. Now, the role of the British left, no matter whether it calls itself the Communist Party of Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party, or any variation of the above, is all essentially they perform the same role. Because these are organisations that are in the working class. They might call themselves all manner of things, but these are organisations that are rooted in the trade union bureaucracy, most of all, and in academia as a second place. And what that gives them is the same mentality that the bureaucrats that they will spend 2.5 years screaming at, and then they'll spend 2.5 years as we get up closer to an election saying, well, we'd better vote Labour again because otherwise the Tories will get in, or the fascists will get in, or Nigel Farage will rise from the grave out of his banned bank account and set up the Sixth Reich in Britain or something. Sounds stupid, but I've been in meetings where various hysterical people from various organisations start saying, we've got to stop X, and that's why we have to get behind Ed Miliband or Keir Starmer. Corbyn gave them some cover because he appeared to be different, but if you look what the man did in office, it wasn't as different as his advertisers would like us to believe. And so the British left plays this role where it hysterically opposes the trade union bureaucracy in words for a little while, and then it goes back to collaborating with them again. And it's all part of the same game. They provide the illusion of an alternative, the illusion that they're engaging in revolutionary struggle, but in every single time, they always turn back towards the Labour Party again. And that is because they are fatally addicted to wanting to return to social democracy. If you look at what all of them talk about in all of their material, it's all got to get back to 1945 to 50. If we could just get back to that again by pressuring the union leaders, finding the right Labour Party leader, if we can just rearrange the deck chairs on this British Titanic that's sinking, then we can somehow magic our way back to an earlier form of capitalist rule. That's really all the British left is interested in. And that is why I say it's a barrier to effective trade union struggle, because these are the organisations that effectively dominate a lot of the organised left inside the trade unions. And they're a barrier to it. And I know this very well because I used to be part of that barrier. Thankfully, I realised that I needed to jump off it. So the role of the left is also crucial, but this feeds into the general problem, which I've touched on already, which is the low level of class consciousness within the British working class. And that this has been the case at least since the end of the miners' strike in 1985, which was a devastating defeat, a devastating blow to working class consciousness and organisation. Also the collapse of the Soviet Union and the generalised offensive against socialism, communism, Marxism, and against the very concept of class politics itself. I went to university in the early 2000s, and one of the big academic grifts of the time was writing books about how there wasn't a working class in Britain anymore. Whereas what in actual fact was happening was that many occupations that used to be better paid were being pushed downwards, and you were actually seeing a wave of proletarianisation going on in many occupations across the country. Even occupations that used to regard themselves as having a special privileged status, like medicine or law, were finding themselves de-skilled and having their terms and conditions cut. Whilst at the same time, of course, they were all screaming that because everybody could buy a TV now on a credit card, that meant that the class struggle was over. And this was a serious academic pursuit. I say serious in heavy inverted commas. But it's all forms part of a cohesive strategy on behalf of the ruling class, which is to deny that there's any class struggle, to make people believe that they're all in it together. This was the big Labour Party project, which they inherited from Thatcher and Major. And it continues to this day. They are still trying to deny that there is a class struggle, and that's because they're the ones constantly waging it. And so one of the things we have to do is to tap into this anger that does exist, this raw, perhaps unfocused anger that is out there beyond the institutional left, in the working class masses that are out there waiting for some kind of struggle to take place that they can actually join. Because the anger is real, the frustration is real. People aren't stupid. They know that they have less at the end of every month. They can see the situation is not going to be improved by the coming of Sir Keir Starmer to power or anybody else. But nobody is going out there and actually taking this level of political education into the class. And that is what we, as socialists, communists, whatever we call ourselves, must be prepared to do. We must be prepared to go around these barriers, make the working class fully aware of the nature of the Labour Party, the nature of the trade unions. Because in the next phase, and I'll conclude on this point, comrades, is that Keir Starmer is probably going to get into office, and it will be his job to wage the class war upon the British working class. And we had better be ready to actually take that message out there and organise the class to lead a struggle not only against Keir Starmer and the wretched Labour Party government, but against their own leaders, against the trade union leaders who will actively try to block that struggle. Because that is going to be the crucial task as we go forward, to try and lead a fight back that can overcome the horrific barriers that seek to shut down the struggle of our class. And we can do that if we go beyond the established movement, beyond the institutional left, and connect with the great masses of the British working class in a direct way. And if we can do that, comrades, I am confident that the struggle in the next period will be a more successful one and can lead us back towards the real rebuilding of an actual communist movement in Britain. Thank you.
No, she already has a talk, but I want to translate what she said.
What I said. Yes, of course. Okay. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, comrades, we pass the mic around. Before I pass this to Victoire, just to introduce our translator, Eleanor. Thank you very much, Eleanor. She's a member of our Central Committee, a fantastic organiser for our party, and very handily speaks French. So she is going to help Victoire in this meeting. Some patience with the translation process will be great. Let me give this to you, Victoire.
The other way around.
C'est bien.
Okay. Sorry.
Are they going to be able to hear me as well?
Yeah, what's good? That's going to be okay, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you.
You tell us. Okay.
Alors bonjour à tous. D'abord, excusez-moi, je ne parle pas anglais, donc Eleonore est obligée de faire la traduction. Voilà.
Hi everybody, I'm apologizing because I don't speak English, so I have to have a translator for the talk today.
Donc j'ai été invitée aujourd'hui parmi vous, à la fois comme membre du bureau national de l'Association nationale des communistes et comme militante de la CGT, la Confédération générale du travail, qui est le principal syndicat de France, pour lequel je coordonne l'activité des chômeurs et des travailleurs privés d'emploi et précaires en Île-de-France. C'est sur l'articulation de ces deux activités, politiques et syndicales, qu'on m'a demandé d'intervenir, ou plutôt sur la manière dont, en tant que militants communistes, nous tentons d'orienter et de diriger l'activité des masses laborieuses, notamment via le syndicat professionnel.
So I've been invited today to speak to you, both as a member of the National Committee of the Association nationale des communistes and as an activist with the Confédération générale du travail, so known as CGT, France leading trade union, for which I coordinate the union activities for the unemployed and precarious workers in the Île-de-France region. I was asked to talk about the relationship between these two activities, political and trade union, or rather about the way in which, as a communist militant, we try to orient and direct the activity of the working class, of the working masses, notably via the trade union.
L'ANC est une organisation fondée en 2016 d'obédience marxiste-léniniste, mais qui n'est pas à proprement parler un parti. C'est plutôt un réseau de cadres et de militants communistes autonomes qui coordonnent leurs activités à l'échelle nationale. La majorité d'entre nous travaillons à l'intérieur des structures de masse déjà existantes, principalement la CGT, parfois à un très haut niveau de responsabilité, mais aussi à l'intérieur des associations ou des collectifs de lutte plus locaux. Nous permettons la double affiliation et certains de nos militants font par ailleurs partie de partis politiques communistes autres.
So our organization, the ANC, was founded in 2016 as a Marxist-Leninist organization, but it's not strictly speaking a party. Rather, it's a network of autonomous communist cadres and activists coordinating their activities on a national scale. The majority of us work within existing mass structures, mainly the CGT, sometimes at a very high level of responsibility, but also associations and association and other political party. We allow dual membership, and some of our militants are also members of different political parties.
La majorité de nos adhérents et de nos militants sont des ouvriers. Et nous avons aussi une activité théorique, politique, de formation et de solidarité internationale indépendante du syndicat. Nous faisons d'ailleurs partie de la plateforme anti-impérialiste mondiale dont fait partie aussi le CPGB-ML.
Yeah, the majority of our members are activists and activists are workers. We also have our own theoretical, political and training activities independent of the union. We are a part of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, of which a CPGB-ML is also a member.
Le principal objectif qui a présidé à notre création était de contribuer à faire émerger les conditions de possibilité de création d'un nouveau parti communiste marxiste-léniniste qui est une véritable base de classe. Des conditions qui, selon nous, ne sont pas réunies aujourd'hui en France.
Our main aim in founding the INC was to contribute to the emergence of the condition necessary for the creation of a new Marxist-Leninist party in France with a genuine class base. Unfortunately, those conditions are not found in France today, right now.
En effet, lors de la contre-révolution libérale entamée dans les années 80 et à la suite de la chute de l'URSS, le Parti communiste français, qui était très plus puissant en France durant tout le XXe siècle et qui avait obtenu de très nombreuses victoires pour la classe des travailleurs, a, à l'instar de nombreux partis communistes européens, opéré un tournant social-démocrate et renoncé peu ou prou à la lutte des classes et au renversement du capitalisme.
When the liberal counter-revolution began in the 1980s and the USSR collapsed, the French Communist Party, which had been very powerful in France throughout the 20th century and had won numerous victories for the working class, followed the example of many European communist parties and made a social democratic turn, more or less renouncing class struggle and the overthrow of capitalism.
Il a imposé une ligne réformiste et électoraliste parfaitement compatible avec le capitalisme. Ça a entraîné son affaiblissement et ses cellules d'entreprise et son ancrage local ont disparu. Quasiment.
It imposed a reformist and electoralist line, perfectly in line with capitalism, and that's led to the weakening of all our branches, especially the one that we had inside in the working places and our local branches.
De nombreux militants l'ont quitté ou ont été purgés. Orphelins d'organisation, ceux-ci se sont alors repliés sur l'activité syndicale ou alors ont fondé de nouveaux partis communistes. Une tentative de rapprochement et de fusion de l'ensemble de ces nouveaux micro-partis communistes a eu lieu dans le courant des années 2000, mais incapable de se mettre d'accord sur les questions théoriques et sur la stratégie à suivre, cela n'a pas abouti. L'écart entre eux s'est alors creusé de plus en plus, une méfiance réciproque s'est installée entre eux, et pour des raisons politiques, mais aussi des raisons personnelles, jusqu'à générer une situation très paralysante et totalement contre-productive pour le camp des travailleurs.
With no organizations to fall back on, the militant who had left the party either turned to trade union activity or founded new communist parties. An attempt was made in the 2000s to bring these micro-parties together and merge them. But as they were unable to agree on the theoretical issues and strategy to be followed, it was unsuccessful. As a result, the gap between them grew even wider, and a mutual distrust grew between them, for political as well as personal reasons, until a very paralyzing and totally counterproductive situation was generated for the working class camp.
Parallèlement, les politiques néolibérales imposées par les élites économiques et leurs émules politiques sous l'égide de l'intégration européenne ont considérablement dégradé les conditions d'existence de la population. À l'instar de tous les pays de l'Occident global, les systèmes de protection sociale ont été progressivement démantelés et privatisés, et le droit du travail a été considérablement réduit, générant une vague de paupérisation et de précarisation de l'ensemble des classes subalternes. Cette situation s'est aggravée avec la crise économique de 2008, qui a servi de prétexte à l'Union européenne pour imposer au peuple des cures d'austérité drastiques, poursuivies par l'arrivée au pouvoir de Macron et de son équipe.
At the same time, the neoliberal policies imposed by the ruling elites and their political servants under the directive of the European Union have considerably worsened the living condition of the population. As in all the countries of the West, social protection systems have been progressively dismantled and privatized, and labor laws considerably reduced, generating a wave of pauperization and casualization of all the lower classes. This situation worsened with the economic crisis of 2008, which served as a pretext for the EU to impose drastic austerity measures on the people, continued by the arrival in power of Macron and his team.
Parallèlement, les organisations de gauche, entre guillemets, se sont considérablement affaiblies, tant d'un point de vue organisationnel que théorique. En effet, le capital dont les bénéficiaires contrôlent non seulement les grands médias, mais également l'ensemble des composantes de l'industrie culturelle, de la culture à la recherche universitaire, a mis en place une véritable contre-offensive idéologique dans le but de tuer dans l'œuf toute la tradition du marxisme de combat qui avait irrigué les grandes luttes politiques et sociales du XXe siècle. Avec la complicité plus ou moins consciente d'une intelligentsia s'autoproclamant progressiste, des organisations d'extrême gauche totalement converties au post-structuralisme, et le déclin idéologique des grandes organisations ouvrières du XXe siècle, les classes subalternes ont été progressivement amenées à oublier l'idée même de la solidarité de classe et l'ensemble des concepts et enseignements de la tradition marxiste-léniniste.
At the same time, the left-wing organization have been considerably weakened, both organizationally and theoretically. Indeed, capital, with beneficiaries control not only the major media, but also all the components of the culture, from culture to university research, has set up a real ideological counter-offensive with the aim of nipping in the bud, of killing in the egg, the whole tradition of combat of Marxist-Leninism that irrigate the great political and social struggle of the 20th century. With the more or less conscious complicity of a self-proclaimed progressive intelligentsia and far left organizations totally converted to post-structuralism, combined with the ideological decline of the great workers' organization of the 20th century, the subaltern classes were gradually led to forget the very idea of the class solidarity and all concept of teaching of the Marxist-Leninist tradition.
À l'inverse, l'anticommunisme de gauche, la méfiance à l'égard de toute idée d'organisation centralisée qui est automatiquement associée à l'autoritarisme, la pensée des classifications en termes de genre, de race ou d'orientation sexuelle ont été ultra valorisées. L'idée même que la maîtrise de la production et de la distribution de la valeur d'usage créée par le travail était un enjeu central de la lutte des classes a décliné. Ça a été facilité par les délocalisations, la désindustrialisation, la précarisation et l'augmentation drastique du chômage, puisqu'elle a rompu dans la tête des travailleurs le lien entre la production et la consommation. Dès lors, toute analyse en termes de réappropriation des moyens de production et de circulation par la classe des travailleurs est devenue, surtout aux yeux d'une jeunesse biberonnée à l'idéologie libérale, une analyse dépassée, voire réactionnaire.
Conversely, left anti-communism distrust of any idea of centralized organization which were associated with authoritarianism and thinking of class issue, often thinking of intersectionalities in terms of genders, race, or sexual orientation have been highly valorized. The very idea of class struggle, of understanding control over production and distribution by the ruling class has completely been erased. This has been facilitated, unfortunately, by relocation, deindustrialization, and the drastic increase in unemployment, which has broken the link between production and consumption in the mind of workers. As a result, any analysis in terms of reappropriation of the means of production and circulation by the working class has become, especially in the eyes of the youth force, fed on liberal ideology and an outdated analysis.
Pour autant, toute contestation sociale n'a pas disparu. Au contraire, depuis la loi travail de 2016, imposée par les socialistes, le degré de conflictualité dans le pays est de plus en plus fort. Cependant, une grande majorité des travailleurs ne disposent plus des outils théoriques et organisationnels leur permettant d'organiser une contre-offensive efficace. En effet, chaque groupe social, en fonction des problématiques immédiates qu'il rencontre dans la vie quotidienne, a élaboré des revendications propres, qu'il s'agisse de la lutte contre le chômage ou le non-accès aux services publics dans les zones rurales, du racisme systémique et de la répression policière dans les quartiers populaires, ou encore des discriminations de genre ou d'orientation sexuelle, sans oublier la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique, qu'aucune analyse systémique du mode de production capitaliste et de la propriété privée des moyens de production ne parvient plus à subsumer. Ça a entraîné une dispersion des luttes qui ne parviennent plus à se coordonner à une échelle globale, tant d'un point de vue des revendications que d'un point de vue organisationnel.
Yet, social protest has not disappeared. On the contrary, especially since the 2016 labor law, the degree of struggle in the country is growing ever stronger. However, a large majority of workers no longer have the theoretical and organizational tool to organize an effective counter-offensive. Indeed, each social group, depending on the immediate problem it faces in its daily life, has developed its own demands, whether it's the fight against unemployment or lack of access to public services in rural areas, systematic racism and police repression in working-class neighborhoods, or discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation, not to mention the fight against global warming, with no systemic analysis of the capitalist mode of production and private ownership of the means of production can subsume. This has led to a dispersal of the struggle that can no longer be coordinated on a global scale.
Non, c'est pas grave.
Sorry.
Des fractures au sein des classes populaires se sont creusées au point de générer une méfiance réciproque qui complique encore la situation. L'incapacité des organisations dites de gauche à dépasser ces fractures et à s'adresser à l'ensemble des classes laborieuses a joué un rôle important dans cette dislocation. Ça a entraîné une régression de la conscience de classe et corrélativement la montée d'une extrême droite largement soutenue par les élites économiques et politiques.
Fracture within the working class have deepened to the point of generating a mutual distrust that further complicates the situation. The inability of the so-called left organization to overcome this fracture and reach out to the working class as a whole has played a major role in this fractured society. That had led to a strong repression of the class consciousness and the rise of the far right, very, very well encouraged by the ruling class, political and economic ruling class.
Dans ce contexte, la construction d'un nouveau parti communiste capable de réunir tous les militants communistes existants est donc devenue une priorité absolue. Or, une des raisons à nos yeux de l'impossibilité pour les communistes de passer outre leurs divergences théoriques est leur peu d'implantation dans le bloc social dont ils prétendent pourtant incarner les intérêts et les éléments les plus avancés. Cela entraîne une survalorisation systématique de la théorie révolutionnaire au détriment de la pratique révolutionnaire, c'est-à-dire une rupture du lien dialectique qui les unit inévitablement. C'est pourquoi l'ANC, en même temps qu'elle travaille directement à renouer les liens entre les différentes fractions du communisme, s'est donné pour deuxième objectif principal de tenter de renouer les liens avec notre bloc social, de tenter de le repolitiser, de l'organiser.
In that context, building a new communist party capable of bringing together all existing communist militants has become an absolute priority. In our view, one of the reasons why it is impossible for communists to overcome their theoretical differences is their lack of a foothold in the local communities, whose interest and most advanced element they claim to represent, as well as a lack of concrete experience of the struggle. Indeed, the main consequence of this lack of presence and practical experience is an overemphasis on revolutionary theory, to the detriment of revolutionary practice, and the breakdown of a dialectical link that inevitably unites them. And taking into account the history of the CGT in France, it was obvious and a big priority that she should be prioritized, a privileged place to realize that objective.
Pour autant, il ne faut pas idéaliser la CGT. Après avoir été dirigée pendant 3/4 de siècle par le PCF, elle n'est pas sortie indemne de cette contre-révolution économique et politique et idéologique dont nous venons de parler. Après avoir perdu une grande partie de ses adhérents dans les années 90, après la chute de l'URSS, elle s'est repliée sur les grands bastions ouvriers et les services publics, eux-mêmes progressivement démantelés et dépolitisés. Par ailleurs, une partie d'entre elles a également renoncé à la lutte révolutionnaire, qui est pourtant inscrite dans ses statuts. Or, cette partie la dirige depuis plus de 30 ans et la pousse autant qu'elle peut à muter vers un pur syndicalisme d'accompagnement et de service et de négociation.
Okay. Just continue.
Ok.
continue.
Plus concrètement, elle a perdu une grande partie de sa capacité à organiser les luttes interprofessionnelles d'ampleur, c'est-à-dire sa capacité à coordonner les luttes des différentes branches de la production et de la distribution. En effet, on assiste depuis de très nombreuses années à un repli corporatiste sur l'entreprise ou la branche professionnelle. Ces instances par nature interprofessionnelles, les unions locales et départementales qui maillent le territoire et dont le rôle est précisément d'organiser cette coordination, ont progressivement été dénuées de moyens humains ou encore laissées entre les mains de bureaucrates plus attachés à conserver leur poste qu'à organiser les travailleurs. De plus, elle a renoncé à organiser des pans de plus en plus vastes de travailleurs en renonçant à adapter ses structures à la multiplication des nouveaux statuts précaires, à l'augmentation de la mobilité des travailleurs et au chômage de masse. Cela entraîne une surreprésentation en son sein de la catégorie des cadres et de l'aristocratie ouvrière au regard de la réalité du salariat d'aujourd'hui. L'élection de Sophie Binet à la tête de la Confédération lors du dernier congrès en mars en est la preuve. Enfin, les simplifications successives de la formation syndicale et le peu de moyens qu'elle y dédie a considérablement abaissé le niveau politique de ses militants, y compris de ses cadres.
However, we mustn't idealize the CGT. After 3/4 of a century ruled by the PCF, it did not emerge unscathed from the material and ideological counter-revolution we have just been talking about. After losing a large proportion of its membership in the 90s, following the collapse of the USSR, its withdrawal to the major working class stronghold and public services, which were themselves gradually dismantled and depoliticized. At the same time, part of it, the CGT, has renounced the revolutionary struggle enshrined in its statutes. And yet, this part of the union has been at the helm for over 30 years, pushing it as hard as it can to move toward pure reformism and service trade unionism, totally serving the capitalist interests and the evolution of capitalism. More concretely, it has lost much of its ability to organize large-scale interprofessional struggle, its ability to coordinate struggle in the different branches of production and distribution. For many years now, we have been witnesses a corporatist withdrawal to the company or professional branch. Its cross-industry bodies, the local and departmental union, that cross the country and whose role is precisely to organize coordination between the various professional unions, have gradually been stripped of their human resources or left in the hand of bureaucrats more concerned with keeping their job than organizing workers. What's more, it has failed to organize ever wider part of the working class by failing to adapt its structure to the multiplication of new precarious statutes, increased worker mobility and mass unemployment. This has led to an overrepresentation of the managerial category and the labor aristocracy compared to the reality of today's salaried workforce. The election of Sophie Binet as the head of the Confederation at the last Congress is proof of this. Finally, successive simplification of union training and the scant resources devoted to it have considerably lowered the political level of its militants, including its managers.
Pour autant, son histoire, ses statuts et ses principes structuraux, ainsi que l'existence de droits syndicaux encore non négligeables, même s'ils sont progressivement réduits, lui permettent d'être en puissance un véritable support de lutte à partir duquel réaliser le travail de politisation et d'organisation des masses. En effet, l'attachement d'une partie de ses membres à l'impératif de la double besogne, c'est-à-dire l'articulation entre les luttes locales immédiates et la lutte pour l'expropriation capitaliste, la souveraineté des syndicats de base, ainsi que l'indépendance vis-à-vis des organisations politiques institutionnelles, ouvrent des marges de manœuvre pour inverser la tendance à l'intérieur.
However, its history by laws and structural principles, as well as the existence of union rights, even if they are progressively reduced in companies with more than 11 employees, mean that it has the potential to become a genuine platform for struggle, providing the basis of the work of politicizing and organizing the masses. Indeed, the attachment of some of its members to the double-binned imperative, so the articulation between immediate local struggle and the struggle for capitalist expropriation, the sovereignty of the rank-and-file unions and their independence from institutional political organization open up margins of maneuver for reversing the trend internally.
Plus concrètement, nos modes d'intervention dans le syndicat sont divers.
Our mode of intervention in the union are very diverse.
Un des premiers champs d'intervention, c'est la formation syndicale des nouveaux adhérents. Souvent négligée dans le syndicat, elle est pourtant un support important de politisation. C'est pourquoi un certain nombre d'entre nous en dispensent, sous des modalités diverses selon la structure de la CGT dans laquelle ils travaillent. Plus largement, le fait même d'organiser des luttes et de côtoyer nos collègues et de leur parler est un facteur de politisation.
On the first area of intervention is union training for new members. Often neglected in the union, it is nevertheless an important medium for politicization. That's why a number of us provide it, in various forms depending on the CGT structure in which they are active. More broadly speaking, the very fact of organizing struggle and rubbing shoulder with our colleagues, talking to them is a factor of politicization.
Un deuxième champ d'intervention consiste à impulser les luttes dans les syndicats professionnels et dans les instances interprofessionnelles et à politiser progressivement leurs revendications. Je prendrai l'exemple de la cellule d'entreprise de l'ANC du syndicat CGT Énergie Paris, qui seront ultra majoritaires dans ces instances exécutives. En 2022, les énergéticiens ont mené une très belle et très longue lutte pour obtenir des augmentations de salaire face à l'inflation. À partir d'une revendication sectorielle, l'augmentation de salaire des agents des industries électriques et gazières, anciennement EDF-GDS, l'entreprise privée qui détenait le monopole de la production et de la distribution d'électricité en France avant d'être progressivement démantelée et privatisée sous l'injonction de l'Union européenne. Ils ont adopté comme revendication principale la remise en place de l'échelle mobile des salaires pour l'ensemble de la population, c'est-à-dire l'indexation des salaires sur l'inflation. De même, pendant le mouvement pour la réforme des retraites, ils n'ont cessé de revendiquer l'élargissement à l'ensemble des travailleurs du régime spécial qui est le leur en tant que travailleurs à statut.
A second field of intervention consists of driving forward struggle within professional union or interprofessional bodies and gradually politicizing their demand. To illustrate my point, I will take the example of a militant of the ANC's company cell in the CGT Énergie Paris union, who have an ultra majority in the executive bodies. In 2022, which saw a very high inflation rate as everywhere else in the world, they led a very fine and long struggle to obtain wage increases, starting with a sectoral demand for higher wage for workers in the electricity and gas industry, formerly known as EDF and GDF, a state-owned company which held a monopoly on electricity production and distribution before being progressively privatized at the demand of the European Union. They adopted as their main demand the reinstatement of a sliding wage scale for the entire population, i.e. indexation of wages to inflation. Similarly, during the movement for pension reform, they did not stop at withdrawing the reform, but never ceased to demand the extension of all workers of a special regime, which is there as workers with status.
Il revendique également depuis de nombreuses années la socialisation de EDF-GDF, c'est-à-dire sa propriété et sa gestion exclusive par les travailleurs et les usagers, afin de faire de l'accès à l'énergie un droit pour toute la population. En appui à cette revendication, il réalise des opérations dites Robin des Bois, rétablissement le gaz et l'électricité aux foyers en difficulté auxquels on a coupé l'électricité parce qu'ils ne peuvent pas payer leurs factures. De même, pendant le mouvement des retraites, en pleine flambée du prix de l'énergie due aux sanctions européennes contre la Russie et la spéculation des grandes multinationales, ils ont passé en heures creuses, c'est-à-dire les heures les moins chères, les artisans boulangers que l'augmentation généralisée des prix de l'énergie et en matières premières avait mené au bord de la faillite.
To give you more example, for many years, they have also been calling for EDF and GDF to be socialized, i.e. owned and managed exclusively by workers and users, in order to make access to energy a right for the entire population. At the same time, they carried out a number of Robin Hood operations, restoring gas and electricity to households in difficulty, who were unable to pay their bills, immediately putting their demands into practice. During the pension movement and in the midst of soaring energy prices, due to the European sanction against Russia and speculation by large multinationals. They gave off peak time the cheapest hours to artisan bakers who had been driven to the brink of bankruptcy by the general rise in energy and raw material prices.
Tout ce travail militant a eu pour conséquence la création d'un collectif de lutte soudé dans l'entreprise et à l'échelle nationale, la politisation de leurs collègues peu politisés, notamment les plus jeunes, de les rendre très populaires à l'intérieur mais aussi à l'extérieur du syndicat. Cette publicité qu'ils ont réussi à donner à leurs actions et revendications auprès de l'ensemble des travailleurs, syndiqués ou non, a eu plusieurs effets. Elle a permis de poser la question de la gestion d'un secteur aussi important que celui de l'énergie, et ce faisant d'élever le niveau politique des masses sur ce sujet, mais aussi de commencer à réduire un peu la fracture entre la CGT et d'autres composantes des franges politisées de la société, qui se méfient beaucoup des syndicats pour de très bonnes et de très mauvaises raisons, notamment les gilets jaunes et les étudiants, voire même certains autonomes. Ce ne sont certes des victoires modestes, mais c'est déjà une belle avancée dans le contexte actuel.
All this militant work result in one, the creation of a close knit collective struggle within the company and on a national scale. 2, the politicization of their less politicized colleagues, especially the younger ones. 3, making them very popular both inside and outside the union. The publicity they succeed in giving to their action and demands among all workers, whether unionized or not, had several effects. On the one hand, it raised the question of the management of a sector as important as energy, and in so doing, raised the political level of the masses on this subject. On the other hand, it has enabled us to begin to narrow the divide a little between the CGT and the other component of the politicized fringes of society that are very suspicious of unions for very good and very bad reasons, notably the gilets jaunes and students, and even some autonomists. You might think that these are modest victory, but it's already a great step forward in the current context.
Un troisième champ d'intervention est sur le plan de la coordination des luttes entre les différents syndicats à l'échelle locale comme nationale. Par exemple, l'Union départementale CGT des Bouches-du-Rhône, qui est dirigée par Olivier Matteux, membre de l'ANC, de même que la quasi-totalité des membres de son bureau exécutif, sont un très bon exemple. Durant le mouvement social que nous venons de vivre, ce département a été un des départements les plus dynamiques, du fait du bon fonctionnement de la solidarité interprofessionnelle et d'un très long travail de coordination des différents secteurs professionnels structurants dans le département. Fort de l'efficacité de leurs actions, ils ont porté un discours politique très radical qui a considérablement augmenté leur popularité partout en France. Au vu de la popularité dont Olivier Matteux jouit parmi les politisés non syndiqués, on peut affirmer que la combativité de son équipe a considérablement contribué à redorer le blason de la CGT. Or, cette CGT qui recommence à parler à toutes les composantes de la classe des travailleurs, c'est bien la ligne de l'ANC, c'est-à-dire une ligne révolutionnaire qui s'appuie sur une analyse en termes de classe et prône la réappropriation des moyens de production et le socialisme.
The departmental union of the Bouches-du-Rhône, headed by Olivier Matteux, who is also a member of the ANC, although his activity is totally focused on trade union activities. The vast majority of his management team are also ANC members. During the social movement, this department was one of the most dynamic thanks to the smooth functioning of cross-industry solidarity and the lengthy coordination work carried out by the department's various structuring professional sectors. Thanks to the effectiveness of their action, they have adopted a radical political stance that has considerably increased their popularity throughout France. In view of Matteu's popularity among non-unionized politicians, it's fair to say that his team, Fighting Spirit, has made a considerable contribution to the CGT's image. And this CGT, which is once again speaking to all sections of the working class, is indeed the INC's line, a revolutionary line based on class analysis, advocating the reappropriation of the means of production and socialism.
Un travail similaire a été réalisé dans l'Union départementale du Nord, avec les mêmes résultats politiques. Dans le Nord, ce ne sont pas des membres de l'ANC qui sont à la tête du bureau exécutif, mais ceux du Rassemblement communiste, une organisation communiste avec laquelle nous avons de tellement bons rapports et des lignes politiques tellement proches que certains de leurs cadres sont membres de nos instances nationales à nous.
Similar work has been carried out in the departmental union of the North, with the same political result. In the north, it's not members of the ANC who head the executive board, but those of the Rassemblement Communiste, a communist organization with which we have such good relation and such close political line that some of the executives are themselves members of the national bodies.
Peu de personnes à l'intérieur du syndicat savent que la ligne politique suivie par ces syndicalistes est celle de cette nouvelle constellation de communistes révolutionnaires dont nous sommes un maillon incontournable. Et cela n'a que peu d'importance car l'ANC n'a pas vocation à perdurer dans le temps. Elle disparaîtra aussitôt que nous serons en mesure de construire un nouveau parti communiste. L'important aujourd'hui est de populariser notre ligne politique plutôt que notre organisation, c'est-à-dire d'opérer un travail de repolitisation et d'organisation des masses, en remettant sur le devant de la scène la nécessité de renverser le capitalisme pour mettre en place le socialisme.
Few people outside of the union are aware of the political line followed by these trade unionists is that of this new constellation of revolutionary communists, of which we are an essential link. And this is of little importance, since the INC is not doesn't have the intention to last. It will disappear as soon as we are in a position to build a new communist party. The important thing now is to make our political line popular rather than our organization, i.e. to work to repoliticize and organize the masses, bringing the need to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism back to the fore.
Or, notre ligne politique commence également à faire son chemin à l'intérieur même des instances nationales de la CGT. En effet, nous avons considérablement contribué avec d'autres camarades à la création d'un nouveau bloc de classe à l'intérieur de la CGT, capable d'inverser le rapport de force à l'intérieur de l'organisation. Il repose sur quelques fédérations importantes, industrie chimique, énergie, port et doc, etc., et quelques grosses unions départementales, donc UD13, UD94, UD49, UD75. C'est lui qui a porté la candidature d'Olivier Matteux pour le poste de secrétaire confédéral lors du dernier congrès. Bien que nous ayons perdu ce congrès, l'analyse des votes des congressistes montre que ce retour d'un vrai syndicalisme de lutte et de classe emportait l'adhésion, ou du moins la sympathie d'un bon tiers de la CGT.
Our line is also beginning to make his way within the CGT's national bodies. Along with other comrades, we have made a considerable contribution to the creation of a new class bloc within the CGT, capable of reversing the balance of power within the organization. It relies on a few major federations, chemical industry, energy, ports and docks, etc., and a few large departmental unions, Union Departmental 13, 94, 49. It was he who put forward Olivier Matteu's candidacy for the post of Confederal Secretary at the last Congress. Although we lost that Congress, an analysis of the delegates' vote showed that this return to a true class-based trade unionism won the support, or at least the sympathy of a good third of the CGT.
Certes, ce bloc de classe est loin d'être encore aussi homogène et structuré que nous le souhaiterions. Pour autant, il représente une vraie force de mobilisation et de politisation aujourd'hui. C'est lui qui a apporté le mouvement pour l'augmentation des salaires de l'automne dernier et qui a été le socle du mouvement contre la réforme des retraites qui en est la suite directe. En effet, ce sont eux qui ont été le socle du blocage économique partiel du pays et qui ont impulsé la grève reconductible dans les secteurs clés de l'économie comme les raffineries, l'énergie ou encore l'industrie du déchet, en tentant de coordonner ces différents secteurs, indépendamment des structures confédérales qui, elles, se sont contentées d'appeler à des journées ponctuelles de mobilisation interprofessionnelle. Car bien que ce mouvement ait été le résultat d'une alliance de facto entre la quasi-totalité des forces contestataires progressistes du pays, et qui ont amené avec elles leurs revendications, leurs modes d'action et leurs spécificités, ce qui explique qu'en l'absence de mouvements de grève massifs, il ait duré aussi longtemps et ait atteint un tel degré de radicalité. Le blocage de l'économie vers lequel presque toutes ces forces ont convergé à partir du mois de mars, via la grève, le blocage des entreprises et des axes de communication, ce sont bien eux qui l'ont rendu possible par la grève et le travail de coordination des forces.
Admittedly, this class bloc is far from being as homogeneous and structured as we like it to be. Nevertheless, it represents a real force for mobilization and politicization today. It was this bloc that led the movement for higher wages last autumn, and was the foundation of the movement against pension reform that followed directly on from it. Indeed, it was there we laid the foundation for the partial economic blockade of the country by instigating renewal strikes in certain key sectors of the economy, such as refineries, the energy sector, and the waste industry, and by attempting to coordinate these different sectors independently of the confederal structure, which within the intersyndical were content to call for one-off days of interprofessional mobilization. For even it is this movement, if this movement was the result of a de facto alliance between almost all the country's progressive protest forces, who brought with them their own demand, mode of action, and specificity, this explains why, in the absence of a massive strike movement, it lasted so long and reached such a degree of radicalism. The economic blockade towards which almost all these forces converge from March onward through strike, blockade of businesses and communication routes was made possible by the strike and the work of coordinating force within certain local and departmental unions.
Nous avons perdu ce mouvement pour des raisons objectives et subjectives. En toute logique, nous ne pouvions le gagner compte tenu de l'état de désorganisation générale et de confusion idéologique des forces progressistes actuelles, ainsi que du degré de radicalisation des élites économiques et politiques dans un contexte de crise mondiale de la valorisation du capital qui les empêche de céder le moindre pouce de terrain et les rend prêts à utiliser toutes les formes de répression possibles et inimaginables pour écraser les travailleurs. Je ne sais pas si t'en es où.
Yeah. It will be interesting to analyze this movement, which we lost for objective and subjective reasons, that we logically could not win, given the state of general disorganization and ideological confusion of the current progressive forces, and the degree of radicalization of the economic and political elites, in a context of global crisis of capital, which prevent them from conceding the slightest inch of ground and make them ready to use all possible and unimaginable forms of repression to crush the workers.
Pour autant, malgré les contradictions et la situation dramatique des travailleurs en France, entre un pouvoir prêt à tout pour imposer son programme et une classe ouvrière si désespérée qu'elle est presque prête à céder aux sirènes du fascisme, ce mouvement a permis des avancées importantes dans la restructuration du bloc de classe au sein des classes populaires françaises, car il a réuni dans une même lutte l'ensemble des éléments politisés au sein de la classe des travailleurs, les a obligés à se mélanger sur le terrain lui-même, piquets de grève, manifestations, ronds-points, etc. Cela a mis en lumière les éléments les plus radicaux et les plus déterminés de toutes ces composantes du bloc contestataire, qu'ils soient syndicalistes, gilets jaunes, militants de l'écologie radicale, étudiants, et les a obligés à travailler ensemble. Ensemble, ils ont été réprimés. Cela a créé des solidarités nouvelles et a contribué à effacer certaines fractures, certaines méfiances. Et dans cette affaire, l'attitude du bloc de classe de la CGT a joué un très grand rôle. Elle a redonné à une partie de la CGT une crédibilité au sein de la classe ouvrière et ce faisant une crédibilité à la ligne que ce bloc de classe porte, la nôtre.
However, despite the contradiction and the dramatic situation in France for workers, between a power ready to do anything to impose its program and a working class so desperate that it's ready to give to a siren of fascism, the movement has made significant progress in restructuring the class bloc within the French working class because it has brought together all the politicized elements within the working class in a single struggle, forcing them to mix on the ground itself. On picket line, demonstration, and roundabouts, in order to hold out as long as possible. In order to hold out as long as possible. This brought out the most radical and determined element of all these components of the protest bloc, be they trade unionists, gilets jaunes, radical ecology activists, students, and forced them to work together. Together they were repressed. This creates new solidarities and help to erase certain fractures, certain mistrusts. In this affair, the attitude of the CGT class bloc played a major role. It gave the CGT back its credibility within the working class, and in doing so, gave credibility to the line that this class bloc carries ours.
Pour finir, je suis désolée, j'ai été très très longue, voilà. Tu le liras. Voilà. Pour finir, je voudrais aborder juste deux derniers points sur lesquels nous travaillons activement à l'intérieur de la CGT. Le premier, est l'International. Nos militants à l'intérieur du syndicat ont toujours défendu ont toujours été en pointe sur l'affiliation internationale de la CGT et de fervents défenseurs de la FSM contre la CES et la CSI.
To conclude, sorry for taking so much of your time. I would like to touch on two final points on which we are actively working with the CGT.
Oui, alors je continue, si tu veux.
Yes.
Pardon.
Le premier.
Are you lost?
Oui, j'ai déjà lu, c'est pas grave. Tac. Pour autant, donc nous affilions la grande majorité de nos structures, celles dans lesquelles nous sommes majoritaires, de fait, à la FSM. Pour autant, c'est une question extrêmement sensible, la question internationale à l'intérieur du syndicat. En effet, le conflit en Ukraine, le bouleversement des équilibres internationaux qui se jouent actuellement, c'est-à-dire la situation d'escalade militaire entre le bloc impérialiste euro-atlantique en crise systémique et une nouvelle constellation d'États bien déterminés à lutter contre son hégémonie économique, financière, idéologique et militaire, a encore davantage tendu la situation. Tensions qui ne sont que le reflet d'une tension à l'échelle de la population tout entière. La France étant un pays impérialiste et compte tenu de la dépolitisation dont nous parlions tout à l'heure, y compris dans les milieux militants, n'est nullement aussi flagrante que sur les questions internationales. La pensée véritablement internationaliste et anti-impérialiste est devenue ultra minoritaire et la propagande anti-chinoise et anti-russe dont le peuple est abreuvé à longueur de journée depuis plusieurs décennies, et particulièrement depuis la guerre en Ukraine, a eu les effets escomptés. Le soutien aux opérations de l'OTAN, qu'il soit assumé ou seulement de facto, est quasi unanime. C'est particulièrement vrai dans les milieux militants organisés, c'est-à-dire dans les différentes organisations politiques dites de gauche, du Parti communiste au NPA en passant par les anarchistes, même s'ils prétendent le contraire. Seules quelques petites organisations marxistes-léninistes comme la nôtre, mais aussi quelques organisations trotskistes, osent se positionner clairement. Et ce problème est aussi vrai à l'intérieur de la CGT. Et il est fort possible que ce soit justement notre positionnement sur la FSM et sur la guerre en Ukraine qui nous ait coûté le Congrès.
So the first point is the international situation. How militants within the union have always been at the forefront of the debate on the CGT's international affiliation, fervently defending the World Forum of Trade Union and criticizing there are a few acronyms in that, I don't know, European Trade Union Congress?
Yeah.
Yes? And the International Trade Union Congress,
Yeah.
I think. The structure in which we have a majority are in fact affiliated to the WFTU. However, this debate is far from being resolved. Indeed, it has been a highly sensitive issue for a long time, making all sort of fuss. The conflict in Ukraine and the current upheaval in the international balance of power, i.e. the international situation of military escalation between the Euro-Atlantic imperialist bloc in systemic crisis, and this new constellation of states determined to fight against its economic, financial, ideological and military hegemony has further strained the situation. A tension which is only the reflection of a tension on the scale of the entire population. Like Great Britain, France is an imperialist country, and nowhere is the depolitization of which we spoke earlier, including in militant circle, more flagrant than on international issues. Generally, internationalist and anti-imperialist thinking has become ultra-minority, and anti-Chinese and anti-Russian propaganda that people have been fed all day long for several decades, and particularly since the war in Ukraine, has had the desired effect. Support for NATO operations, whether assumed or merely de facto, is almost unanimous. This is particularly true in organized militant circle in the various political organizations known as leftists, from the Communist Party to the NPA, which is a small Trotskyite organization, not forgetting the anarchists, and even if they claim the opposite. Only a few small Marxist-Leninist and Trotskyite organizations dare to take a clear stand.
Yeah. Weird.
C'est vrai.
It's quite possible that it was our position on the WFTU and the war in Ukraine that cost us the Congress.
Pour autant, nous poursuivons notre travail en interne. Nous continuons d'affilier nos structures à la FSM quand nous le pouvons. Par ailleurs, nous travaillons à la mise en place d'une vaste campagne interne à la CGT qui double notre activité politique en tant qu'ANC sur ce sujet, sur la thématique de la guerre impérialiste, contre la militarisation de l'économie et l'envoi d'armes en Ukraine et pour la sortie de l'OTAN. L'objectif de cette campagne est d'agréer et de coordonner l'activité des quelques structures CGT qui portent ce sujet et d'en inciter d'autres à prendre position dans un contexte très délicat où toute voie divergente risque sa tête. Plusieurs initiatives en ce sens sont prévues dès la rentrée. Nous verrons ce que cela donne, mais j'ai bon espoir que nous arrivions à quelque chose. En effet, malgré l'anathème, les langues se délient peu à peu. Quoi qu'il en soit, une prise de position ferme du bloc syndical de classe sur cette question ne pourrait que renforcer les liens et accointances qui ont commencé à se former, notamment avec les Gilets jaunes.
Nevertheless, we continue to work internally. This involves regular contact with the WFTU, to which we affiliate our structure whenever we can. In addition, we are working to set up a vast internal CGT campaign, which doubles our political activity as ANC on this subject, on the theme of imperialist war, against the militarization of the economy and the sending of arms to Ukraine, and for the exit from NATO. The aim of this campaign is to agree and coordinate the activity of a few CGT structures that are active on this issue and to encourage others to take a stand in a very delicate context where any dissenting voice risks its head. Several initiatives all along this line are planned for the autumn. We will see what's happened, but I'm confident we will get somewhere. Indeed, this... Indeed, despite the repression, tongues are gradually loosening. In any case, a firm stance on this issue from the class union bloc could only strengthen the link and acquaintance that have begun to form, particularly with the Gilets jaunes, who are very mobilized on this issue.
Pour finir, je voudrais faire un point très rapide sur la manière dont nous essayons de travailler tant bien que mal à contraindre la CGT à organiser les travailleurs privés d'emploi et précaires, qui représentent plus de 30% de la population active, notamment les jeunes et les habitants des quartiers populaires. C'est un travail très long et très compliqué, car cela suppose de s'attaquer directement à l'inadéquation de la structuration de la CGT avec la réalité du salariat d'aujourd'hui et à s'opposer à la stratégie développée depuis les années 90 de repli et de focalisation sur les bastions historiques, c'est-à-dire les travailleurs à statut, les fonctionnaires et les travailleurs des services publics et les salariés des grosses entreprises.
Finally, I would like to make a very quick point about how we are trying to work as best as we can to force the CGT to organize precarious workers and the unemployed, who represent over 30% of the working population, especially young people and people living in working class areas. This is a very long and complicated task because it means tackling head-on the inadequacy of the CGT structure with the reality of today's wage earner and opposing the strategy developed since the 90s of withdrawing and focusing on historical bastions, i.e. workers with status, civil servants and public service workers, and also employees of large companies.
Là, je vais juste reprendre ici.
Ici?
Workers with statutes. You mean contracts?
Yeah.
Yes.
Employment contracts.
They have special statutes, so
Statutes.
they can earn
Statutes.
Oh.
Sorry. Yes, they have retirement, early retirement, and all those kind of things.
Right. So with the ones with good employment conditions and
Yeah.
good rights.
Yes.
Donc je
And they
reprends
tend to be
ici.
strongly unionised.
Yeah.
Je reprends ici.
Contraindre. Okay. Forcing.
Ouais. Donc, contraindre la CGT à mettre en place une véritable stratégie d'organisation de ces travailleurs suppose un énorme travail politique à l'intérieur des structures elles-mêmes. Ça, par contre, t'enlèves la dernière phrase, on s'en fout.
Ok.
Pour autant, nous y travaillons, notamment à travers le Comité national des travailleurs privés d'emploi et précaires, dont je fais partie, et qui coordonne l'activité des comités locaux basés dans les unions locales. À la tête de cette structure, les membres de l'ANC sont très, très majoritaires. Ce comité est le problème, c'est que ce comité est totalement dépendant financièrement de la Confédération, dont elle est une des organisations spécifiques, et donc elle est soumise au bon vouloir du bureau confédéral. celui-ci n'étant pas favorable à une ligne de classe, il nous donne très très peu de moyens et nous en donne même de moins en moins. Voilà.
Okay. Forcing the CGT to put in place a real strategy for organizing these workers therefore presupposed a huge amount of political work within the structures themselves. Nevertheless, we're working on it, notably through the Comité national des travailleurs privés d'emploi et précaires. So it's a national committee for private workers and precarious workers, of which I'm a member, and which coordinates the activity of local committees based in local unions. The majority of these structures' leaders, who, let's be honest, can be counted on the fingers of one hand at a national level, are members of the ANC, of friendly political organization. And yet, this national committee is totally dependent financially on the Confederation, of which it is one of the specific organizations which makes its existence and the nature of its activity subject to the goodwill of the Confederal Office. Given this context, you can imagine that for many years now we've had very little and even fewer and fewer resources, despite a vote at the last Confederal Congress, during which we won a major political victory by making the strengthening of the committee a priority for the organization.
Cependant, faisant mauvaise fortune bon cœur, nous continuons de travailler et de structurer cette activité et parvenons peu à peu à nous implanter dans les quartiers populaires, à construire des collectifs de lutte en lien avec les associations de quartiers et avec l'aide de certaines unions locales conscientes de l'enjeu que représente l'organisation de la jeunesse de ces quartiers, qui constitue la partie la plus paupérisée et exploitée de la classe des travailleurs, l'armée de réserve par excellence, soumise au racisme systémique, lui-même instrument du capital pour casser les solidarités et les maintenir dans cet état de surexploitation et aux violences policières récurrentes. Parallèlement, nous parvenons peu à peu à convaincre les syndicats professionnels de travailler avec nous et à davantage prendre en compte la précarité des travailleurs dans la stratégie de lutte interne. Donc c'est à suivre. Voilà.
But we continue to work and structure our activity and are gradually succeeding in establishing ourselves in working class areas, mainly populated with migrant population, building struggle collectives in conjunction with neighborhood association and with the help of certain local union aware of the stacks involved in organizing the youth of these areas. They are the most impoverished and exploited part of the working class, the reserve army of excellence, subject to systemic racism, itself a tool of capital to break down solidarity and keep them in this state of overexploitation and recurrent police violence. At the same time, we are gradually convincing the professional union to work with us and take greater account of worker precariousness in their struggle strategy. So this work this work is still ongoing, and I will keep you updated. I'll stop here and thank you for your.
J'ai été très long.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you.
Merci.
It's very difficult to come and speak in a meeting where you're not addressing an audience that speaks the same language as you. It's also very difficult to be tasked with the translation when you're not a professional translator. Eleanor, I'm going to let you translate. Your job's not over.
Merci beaucoup de ta présence ici. C'est très dur de parler à un meeting avec une audience qui ne parle pas ta langue, et c'est aussi très dur pour un traducteur d'arriver à suivre.
I was going to start our question and answer session by asking a question to Victoire, but in fact you answered me right at the end of your presentation, so I don't need to ask you that.
Okay.
Je voulais commencer.
J'ai compris.
Okay.
But I will underline a few points I think jumped out at me from Victoire's speech, which I think are very important. So, you understood that?
Je vais mettre
en lumière des points.
Oui.
Okay.
And apologies because I forgot my glasses today, so I'm squinting at my notes a bit. The question I was going to ask, and don't need to ask, but the point that I feel needs underlining, is that it has for a long time seemed to me that there's a kind of a parallel world in the French working class between those who are well unionised with good rights, who are very militant in defence of those rights, and you see wonderful struggles, but there's a whole section of the French working class population, almost an underclass, not represented in those struggles, not represented in those unions, not taking part, who don't have the same rights to defend. And Victoire has explained that to us, in fact, very well in the last part of her speech, that that's exactly the section of the working class that her work is aimed at reaching, and that her work is aimed in the CGT is aimed at drawing into the structures of the union, and that this is a deficiency, that I was right when I looked at the French working class and said, something funny happening. And the sort of parallel worlds we see of the very militant, organised, in defence of their rights, and then this sort of very almost separate underclass of the banlieues, mainly migrants, very, very often young, police repression, racism, and this sort of slightly parallel universe that we see in France. And we see in many countries, in fact. And we also see it in our own country. I remember working in the trade unions in Britain and trying to talk to union leaderships about the fact that there's a huge immigrant workforce in Britain and we are doing nothing to bring them into our structures.
Okay.
You okay?
Yes, basically.
Another point I think is really important from Victoire's speech I wanted to just underline was this constant pressure on Marxists who are active in the trade union movement on international issues. Internationalism is anathema to an imperialist ruling class, and they do absolutely everything they can to separate trade union consciousness from real proletarian internationalist consciousness, from an understanding of workers in the imperialist heartlands, that their struggle and their conditions of life have a connection to the situation of workers abroad, that they, when they fight for their rights in terms of pensions and pay, should understand its connection to the suppression of workers abroad. And the pressure that comes on those who try to bring a real understanding of imperialism into the trade union movement is unrelenting and has to date been very effective. In France and in Britain, we see the results of that supremacist ideology is rife in the trade union movement, chauvinism, a general sense of superiority, and that the foreigners are something separate to us, and the war is something separate, and a willingness to go along with ruling class jingoism on the question of the drive to war.
Donc, tout est fait pour séparer. L'autre point que je voulais mettre en lumière dans ton discours, c'est les syndicats et la question internationale. Parce que tout est fait dans les pays impérialistes pour séparer ces deux problèmes. Donc, les syndicats et les travailleurs sont complètement redirigés de la question de la question internationale. Et une pression énorme est mise sur ceux qui essaient justement de mettre la lumière sur ces questions. Avec il y a un chauvinisme très potent qui est poussé et mis en avant, et une volonté de complètement séparer ces deux issues.
And the third point is really the first point, which is the whole experience that Victoire related to us, and that we've seen, from the limited contact we've had and reports we've had from France, but has been fleshed out really helpfully for us from Victoire's speech, is that when the masses are moving, the masses can learn. Mm-hmm. And the job of communists is to be there, helping them to learn their lessons accurately and quickly. But the longer the people can be kept moving, acting working, the more open they are to learning the lessons, the more opportunities there are for them to learn, and the more open they are to the people who can help them to learn those lessons. And Victoire's given us some really great examples of direct action being taken by workers. And what is the major role? If you're a communist, what's the major role of trade union work? We call them a school of communism. Why? Because you learn to be a communist there? No. Because you learn that the working class has power. You learn it not just theoretically, but concretely. You learn to use it, you learn to feel it, you learn to exercise it. You know, when Victoire gave us this example of energy workers going out and turning back on, reconnecting customers who their bosses had disconnected. This is not charity. This is workers using their power. Totally different thing. This is why we call the trade unions a school for communism. Because it's the lesson the workers need in order to prepare them to make revolutionary struggle. They have to have the consciousness and the belief in their ability. And that's what the ruling class tries so hard to take from us, and what this type of struggle infuses into the workers. You got it. Brilliant. So I'm going to abuse my position as chair by starting the Q&A session.
You're not actually at the mic.
I expect you can hear me though. You can hear me though, right? I'll just put it here. I'm going to start the Q&A session by asking Alex if he could just talk to us a little bit more about the mechanisms of control in the trade union movement, and specifically the role that the left play. Because all my life as a trade unionist and as a political operative, I have run into people, particularly from the SWP, the Socialist Party, the CPB, who boast continuously about their connections with the working class. And the proof of this is their involvement in the trade unions and the number of positions they hold in trade union committees and bodies and leaderships and all the rest of it. And this is proof that they have an organic connection, they always tell us, with the working class, not like you crazy extremists. We're connected to the working class, they tell us. But yet, I don't see, in the way that trade unions behave, any impact of this connection of the so-called radical left in the trade unions. So what is the role that they play in this whole bureaucracy?
Very low-paid policemen, basically. The role of the left and the trade unions, I mean, you mentioned that people list the number of committees that they're on and the number of posts they hold. I once held 2 national posts, 1 regional post and 1 workplace post. It didn't make me any more connected to the working class. It made me more connected to the other elements in the trade union bureaucracy. That's what holding all these positions does. And the job becomes not representing the working class, the job becomes holding on to the position. And that's because the party that they're members of, whether it be any of those organisations Jyoti's just mentioned, or even like supposed anarchist type figures, prioritise holding on to the position. Now, how do you hold on to the position? You limit what the working class can actually engage in. And you do that by demoralising the class. You do that by going before a meeting full of workers and saying, well, comrades, we've tried, we've had a really great strike, but the employers just aren't shifting, and so it looks like 8% over 2 years, possibly over 3 years, is the best we can possibly do, unless, and I'm willing to do this, we go out on all-out strike now, and we just carry on until we win. So that what they do is then, I'm kind of joking, but this is the technique, you present then an ultra-left position, saying that the only way to win is like all-out strike, and you know what happened to an all-out strike, so it'll be like the miners and we'll inevitably lose. That's the way in which the left polices the consciousness of the working class, by positing it in a case of either nothing or everything, 0 to 100, with no stages in between. The idea of building a struggle patiently and building, bringing in new layers of the working class into that struggle, of raising the level of consciousness, all of that is put to one side, And all that these groups are really interested in is manipulating the working class into a conclusion that is acceptable for the higher-up trade union bureaucracy, because it's about preserving their position over and above everything else, preserving the position of all these different groups within Unite, within Unison, within GMB, and that leads them into accepting all kinds of reactionary things. It's what leads leftist groups to suddenly declare that the aggressor in Ukraine is Russia, or that we should get behind a rearmament program, or that we should ultimately vote Labour. It's all about clinging on to that position within the bureaucracy, and it leads them to be essentially the bureaucracy's policemen. And that's what they have been for a very long time, and that coming out of a time of comparatively low levels of class struggle in Britain, it means they're also guardians of conservatism within the movement. Victoire was noting the struggle in France to go and organise the precarious workers, those who aren't in the trade unions, those who are very low paid, those who are on short-term contracts. Well, we've been banging that drum in Britain, or we tried to, for many years, and the response from the higher-ups and most of the left organisations was to do an event, say, we've now done this X number of events about organising McDonald's workers or organising cleaners who are working on precarious contracts. We've done the event, job done. We tried. The workers weren't interested, comrades. Better to go back and carry on defending what we've got. And the idea of actually expanding the movement now is something which is anathema to them, because that involves, first of all, effort. Some of these people are incredibly lazy. Also, it involves running a risk. And you're running a risk because you're pushing into areas of the economy that have been deliberately kept outside of the realm of trade union organisation in order to enable hyper-exploitation of the most vulnerable areas of the class. Frequently these are, as it is the case in France, low-paid migrant workers who don't have any history in the trade union movement. And even though they'll hold 10 seminars a year saying all about, well, we need to unionise these people, they never do it because it involves a head-on collision with the employers, with the government, and they don't want to do that because, again, that's too risky. That might risk their position. They might offend the higher-ups in the TUC or the Labour Party. And that's why action on this has been so contemptibly slow, because they just don't want to do it. And the risk is, of course, that by not doing that, we're leaving whole areas of the class completely unorganised and not being brought into that struggle, when it is our job as communists to take that, first of all, the basics of class organisation to as wide layers of the working class as possible, and then to bring them into the class and unite the class around a core set of demands. And the union movement at the moment is not only not doing that, but they are actively opposed to doing that, and the left acts as their policeman in enforcing that line.
Sorry, I should have interrupted you.
Donc là, je vais te le traduire. Donc le rôle des syndicats en Angleterre, et dans le rôle de policier le mouvement. J'avais 3 différents rôles dans ces unions, et aucun ne m'a rendu proche des masses travailleuses, mais plutôt de la bureaucratie. Il y a une limite du champ d'action, une démoralisation des travailleurs en leur mentant et en leur présentant une position soit gauchiste, désolé, ou alors une position défaitiste. Donc c'était le tout ou rien. Soit on va en grève et on lâche rien et dans tous les cas on perd, soit on se contente de miettes. Donc l'idée d'organiser un vrai mouvement coordonné est complètement mis de côté pour préserver leur position. Donc et souvent les conduit à devenir réactionnaires, comme surporter la guerre en Ukraine et pousser à envoyer plus d'armes. Elles sont aussi très conservatrices dans leur approche à faire grandir le mouvement, tant qu'elles se contentent des bastions qu'elles ont déjà gagnés. Et il y a une grande collusion avec les gouvernements. Donc le rôle des unions est carrément de contenir le mouvement dans les limites dans lesquelles le capital veut le garder.
So what we see, comrades, as we come into this period of intensifying struggle,
Oui, ok. Elle a compris. She understood.
is that the ruling class in Britain has really achieved for itself a very strong, institutionally embedded machinery of control of the working class?
Ce qu'on voit, c'est que la classe dirigeante a
Construit une machine.
construit, voilà, exactement.
It's very effective. I've seen how it works on many, many levels and how professional are the gatekeepers of the trade union movement in controlling what they constantly call democracy and what is actually a total perversion of working class democracy.
Très efficace. Donc, ils ont créé une version pervertie de la démocratie.
So I'd like to open up at this point to the people in the hall. Any questions to either of our panellists or contributions about your own experiences?
If you speak slowly and articulate very well, she can understand.
That's what we
Comrade.
always do with
No.
foreigners.
Just be English.
I suspected that was the case.
Colin.
Can you say something about, in both contexts, what happens when the trade union comes to a point where it meets the law and it has to contend with the laws that will limit the action of the trade unions? You know, obviously, to be effective, there is that battle. You know, it's not just with the bureaucracy of the unions and the self-serving interests of the leaders, but also the leaders' reluctance to take the unions beyond what is the
Legal.
prescribed limits of what the unions can do. So, maybe in both those contexts, you know, what is the way forward for trade unions in that context?
Also, you're being very unfair to Jeremy Corbyn. Like, you want to insult Tony Blair or Tory Blair, fair enough. But Jeremy Corbyn, look at the amount of struggle he had. I know he's got a little bit of money behind him, but it's like a good Batman. He had, what's his name? The Australian guy, the right-wing guy, with Murdoch, etc., etc. They're all pinned against him. Anyone, unless they were trade union or whatever, they're essentialists, they're all against Corbyn. And given Corbyn's age as well, and he's been there how many decades? Like he was there in his 40s or something, if not earlier. I'm not sure what actual work is done, but he's done everything he could to represent people like myself. Corbyn is one of a few, so I understand that Simon's here, just go facing how to do. I've come a long way from my friend here. First of all, it's an honour to be here, thank you. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't know all the facts about Corbyn, but it's actually thanks to Corbyn, because I went to Waterstones, and Corbyn helped sell a book on Frederick Engels and Karl Marx, and Simonson being accused of being anti-Semitic. I think that's quite important. I've also been accused of being anti-Semitic myself. There's another reason why I left the Labour Party, because I used to be on Facebook, and there was pictures on Facebook about Orthodox Jews, the alleged lobbying, which had questionable legal, ethical, moral consequences, and also questioned the Palestinian people, well not them, but they'd be persecuted by the Israeli government, and apparently I was sent a letter from the Labour Party questioning my mental health, because I'm autistic, and I actually called them the day after, and I said, you continue to accuse me of being anti-Semitic, etc., I'll get my PRP papers, and I'll make a counterclaim of you being disabled, because it wasn't just 12 million people that died in the camps who got murdered. You've got the other 6 million, sorry. You've got the disabled, you've got the trade unions, homeless, unemployed. Apart from BAME and the eligible huge unity, I could probably, now I don't want to insult these people.
Comrade, thank you for your...
You know, I could be here a week.
Yes, I can see. We could probably have a conversation after the meeting about Corbyn. I'd be happy to do that with you.
As far as I'm concerned, he was Labour's last hope.
Yes, it's a point of view that we could talk about afterwards, but I'm going to bring it back to the questions that have been asked specifically. Colin, just recap, you were asking about the law, right? Are you able to translate that one, Eleanor?
I would like him to just reframe it a little bit.
So let me paraphrase and you tell me if I've got the essence.
Yeah.
I think the question was along the lines that what is your experience and what is your advice to workers and to trade union leaders in the context that their struggle comes up against the barrier of what is legal and what is not legal. In Britain, we have a particularly hostile legal environment. I'm not quite sure if it's the same in France, so maybe Victoire can tell us if that is a problem for the struggle.
Quelle est ton expérience et tes conseils pour les leaders de syndicats quand il s'agit de rester dans le cadre de la loi, respecter la loi, ou quand tu es confronté à la loi dans les différentes actions que tu peux entreprendre?
C'est une grande question, une vaste question. Bah, alors, en règle générale, quand même, la grande majorité des militants CGT ne veulent pas contrevenir à la loi. Il faut le dire.
Okay, so it's a vast subject, but in the vast majority, most of the trade union militant of the CGT don't want to go against the law.
Après, il y a certains moments où c'est nécessaire. Par exemple, s'il faut envahir une usine ou envahir un pôle emploi ou envahir quelque chose quand on a bloqué, par exemple, les usines.
There are some moments where it's necessary, and I can give you an example of when we occupied factories or
Blockaded the port?
Blockade, no ports, but we have job centers or blockade job centers.
En fait, la question est que nous, on considère par principe que si c'est nécessaire, on doit contrevenir à la loi. Ceci étant dit, il faut que le gain soit en proportion avec la répression qui va aller avec. Parce que, on a tous subi la répression, que ce soit la répression policière, les coups, tout simplement, des gardes à vue ou la répression judiciaire. Et que du coup, il faut vraiment mesurer ce qui est pertinent et ce qui l'est moins en regard de la répression qu'il va subir.
So we consider that if it's necessary, we can go against the law, but we have to be very careful and choose carefully the action that we want to, the cause that we want to go against the law for, because there is a heavy repression. So does it worth it or no to break the law for this action?
D'ailleurs, là, nous, par exemple, les comités chômeurs, on est de plus en plus réprimés. Il y a des procès qui nous ont été faits. On a été interpellés de très nombreuses fois. Dans l'énergie, dans le syndicat Énergie Paris, il y a eu des procédures judiciaires qui ont été faites contre eux, des procédures disciplinaires, des plaintes qui ont été déposées de la part de l'entreprise, mais également la justice qui s'est auto-saisie. Du coup, il y a une répression judiciaire très, très importante. Il y a eu 5 camarades de l'énergie qui ont été mis en garde à vue pendant 96 heures par la DGSE, l'équivalent en fait de la brigade antiterroriste, là au mois de janvier. Des syndicalistes qu'on a amenés en garde à vue, qui ont eu des amendes très lourdes, qui ont été licenciés. Du coup, c'est toujours ça. C'est que si l'enjeu, si ce qu'on doit gagner vaut l'enjeu, vaut la répression derrière, on y va. Mais il faut savoir le doser. Si ça vaut pas le coup, on n'y va pas parce qu'on n'est pas là non plus pour se cramer direct, quoi.
Okay. So we are heavily repressed, so in the streets by the police and also judiciarily. So a lot of our unionists are arrested and prosecuted by the government for their action, and they have heavy fees to pay. So we really have to wage the benefit that we can earn in the end before to wage the struggle.
But they're not frightened of breaking the law. They balance the cost to benefit each time.
Mais de toute façon, je veux dire, la loi n'est pas faite pour nous. Donc on est obligé à un moment donné de contrevenir à la loi si on veut pouvoir arriver à quelque chose. Après, il faut prendre en compte la répression derrière. On n'est quand même pas extrêmement nombreux. Du coup, on évite de se faire casser immédiatement. On a encore une longue année de travail devant nous.
Okay, so the law is not designed for us, so we have to be very careful. We're very small, so we cannot all get arrested or lost everything in the struggle now.
Understood. Thank you. I'm going to ask.
I have the same question for Alexander.
I'm going to ask Alexander to ask the same question.
Okay. Well, the anti-trade union laws in Britain are very well designed because they make the trade union leaders basically responsible for enforcing them, and because they can, under all the different concentrated trade union legislation from the Employment Acts and Industrial Relations Act onwards, they make the union leadership bear a responsibility for any illegality as defined by the laws, which means it's the union's assets which get confiscated if the law is broken, sequestration, and that, of course.
Just to let Ellie know.
Okay.
Les lois syndicales sont très bien écrites. Les lois antisyndicales sont très bien écrites dans ce pays. Donc ce sont les leaders des unions qui prennent toute la responsabilité pour tout ce qui est action contre l'État. Et donc ça force du coup ces leaders à prendre le moins de risques possible.
So to get around them, and to come to the crux of the question, it's a matter of, first of all, balancing, as Victoire was saying in her answer, what is worth actually breaking the law for and what is not worth it. You don't just want to say, sod it, let's go out and get arrested. That's what being an anarchist is for. But you have to make a judgment. Is this situation going to lead, by breaking the law, to an increase in the level of consciousness? Is it going to improve the struggle? Is it going to lead the workers to either win something or discover something important? Is it going to draw more layers into the struggle by doing so? And those are the important questions to ask. Now, to conclude the point, the only way to overcome them is the way in which it has been done in the past, which is if you look back into history, the mass trade union struggles of the early 1970s, which were often done in defiance of or in protest against new anti-trade union laws, where they were overcome by the simple amount of workers in the streets. I'll pause for a moment.
Ok. Donc, il disait, qu'est-ce qui vaut le risque de briser la loi pour? Est-ce que cette action va élever la conscience de classe, ou alors mettre les travailleurs contre du coup l'union, vu que ça sera publicisé comme quelque chose de violent? C'est tout ce que j'ai pu noter.
Did you get the bit about in the 1970s?
No, I didn't.
All right, I'll go back to it. In the 1970s in Britain, when the union movement was at its strongest, they were able to overcome anti-trade union laws by mass resistance, by pulling out so many workers that the police could not possibly arrest them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Donc dans les années 70, quand le mouvement était très puissant, ils étaient capables d'avoir des mouvements de masse où la police n'arrivait pas à les canaliser.
And so we must learn that lesson. It seems to us now as if that is a long way away, but it is the only way that we're going to get around the laws and through them, and to actually overcome our current situation by reaching the point where millions of workers are prepared to defy them, therefore removing the power of the trade union leadership to stop us, and also severely weakening the power of the state in terms of its ability to intimidate. There's millions of workers suddenly feeling their collective power out in the street, seeing that production has stopped and seeing their power in action. That will create a huge force that the state, as it is currently constituted, will find very hard to resist.
Du coup, on doit apprendre de ce mouvement des années 70, parce que si tous les travailleurs ou la majorité des travailleurs sont dans la rue à résister contre la police, l'État se retrouvera très vite submergé, et surtout si on arrive à stopper la production et à affaiblir l'État dans son fonctionnement.
Absolutely. Ranjit.
If I make it very small.
No, please come.
Just pushing the camera. Hello. So thanks all for that, some brilliant contributions and points. I think there's a question I want to ask.
and to make a kind of a very brief kind of look at my experience of industrial action of the medical profession, which is like not really a profession. It's like they don't consider themselves workers. They've been pushed to consider themselves a profession, a professional body who can negotiate, not like other workers who really are paid a wage.
J'aimerais partager avec vous mon expérience dans le syndicat médical, qui vraiment ne se considèrent pas comme des travailleurs, puisqu'ils sont très privilégiés. Et, yeah.
But really, they have the same strategy and tactics as we've looked at here. If I go back to 2014, I participated in the first industrial action of doctors since the 70s.
Ils ont quand même la même structure que la plupart des unions. Et j'aimerais vous partager l'expérience à laquelle j'ai pris part. Enfin, partager les différentes expériences dans lesquelles j'ai pris part depuis 2017, 2017.
Since the 1970s.
1970, des années 70.
And it was trying to guard against casualisation, decreased pay and conditions, and decreased ability to whistle, blow and safeguard the service. So it was key, a new contract was introduced that was key to really dismantling the National Health Service as we knew it up until that time.
Donc ils ont introduit des nouveaux contrats pour augmenter la précarité et complètement détruire le NHS, le système de santé gratuit, tel qu'il a été établi à la base.
The struggle was initially coordinated by, people who were politically Tories. They were right wing but connected. They were just asking for a bit more money. They couldn't see why they couldn't get it, and they organised it in quite a effective way, in a way that they weren't trying to upend the system, but they thought through dialogue they'd achieve their ends.
Donc la lutte était dirigée par les conservateurs. Ils voulaient plus d'argent et ils pensaient qu'en négociant avec l'État, ils pourraient avoir ces augmentations qu'ils demandaient.
At a certain point, they had a quiet word with, and they essentially dropped the struggle and handed it over to a group who considered themselves. I met some of them. I met them on several occasions. They considered themselves far left, by which they were probably semi-Trotskyite, but mainly just Labour Party. They were Labour Party, and in particular at that time, it was the kind of Corbyn had just become the elected leader of the Labour Party, and their ultimate aim was to use the strike as a vehicle to promote Jeremy Corbyn as the answer to all problems, including of the junior doctors.
Donc à un certain point, ils ont complètement abandonné le mouvement et l'ont donné à un groupe de gauchistes qui très probablement était trotskyite et qui comptait sur l'élection de Jeremy Corbyn pour gagner des droits. Il était complètement affilié au Labour Party.
Now, we have a lot of laws that make it difficult to have industrial action. You have to have overwhelming support. The ballots have to be run and supervised in a certain manner. But they went through all those hoops and they had overwhelming support of the profession for the action. But once this group took over, first of all, they suspended action for a long period of time without any communication with the membership. None of us knew what was happening at all, what the next step was going to be, whether we were going to have industrial action. It was just total black box, no communication.
Donc nous avons beaucoup de lois contre les grèves et quand ce groupe a pris le pouvoir, ils ont complètement suspendu la communication avec la base et donc on ne savait pas quand est-ce qu'on allait aller en grève ou quand est-ce qu'on allait aller en grève, plus jamais grève.
And then suddenly they announced, after this very long pause, previously we had quite short periods of limited action preserving the on-call service so that we wouldn't alienate the workers who use the service, who we care about, and we wouldn't endanger our patients, but we'd put pressure on the government to negotiate.
Donc on a toujours eu des courtes périodes d'action parce qu'on ne voulait pas mettre en danger, on ne voulait pas aliéner le public contre nous et on ne voulait aussi pas mettre en danger les patients qu'on avait dans le service, dans nos différents services.
And then this new leadership sprang into action and said, in 1 week's time, we're going to come out on total strike. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be a 7-week, so 1 week of total withdrawal of all cover, of everything. So it would have led to total collapse of the service.
Et donc ce groupe du coup en charge leur a donné un préavis de 1 semaine, après avoir complètement coupé la communication, un préavis d'1 semaine qui leur disait qu'ils allaient aller en grève et complètement cesser toute activité.
And you couldn't have designed a better strategy for going from pretty much 100% support of the profession for the action to like 0%. Everyone was like, well, it's just too much. We can't possibly do that. There's not enough time. How are we going to do it? There's no communication. What will happen to our patients? This is unethical. How can I do it? I can't justify. So it was like, just gone. No support at all.
Donc c'était une stratégie, c'était la meilleure stratégie en fait pour paniquer en fait les gens plutôt que de les organiser et que rien ne s'organisait au final.
At which point they said, there's no longer any support for industrial action. Full stop. And that was the end of the strike. And the contract that we were fighting against was imposed.
Et donc ils ont utilisé ce prétexte pour dire qu'il n'y avait pas de support, il n'y avait pas de soutien pour le mouvement, donc tout a été arrêté.
So this was 100% victory for the government over the medical profession. And it was organised by the most left radical pro-Corbyn Trotskyite group of leaders of the profession.
Ce qui a permis de donner une victoire 100% au gouvernement sur la profession médicale. Et ça a été organisé par un groupe qui se disait de gauche et qui soutenait Jeremy Corbyn.
And right at this moment, not only the juniors have in strike industrial action again, they're having quite reasonable actions, 48 hours. And the consultant body have also voted to strike because we've seen our pay, which is, we're a privileged group of workers. We're like tube drivers.
Can you make this point again, sorry?
Right now we're in industrial action again. The consultants, as well as the junior doctors, are currently in industrial action within the NHS. And we are unquestionably a privileged group of workers. We are like tube drivers.
Et donc actuellement, les médecins, les internes et les médecins consultants, donc seniors, sont en grève, même s'ils sont considérés comme les travailleurs les plus privilégiés, comme les conducteurs de train.
But consultants' pay has gone down 35% over the last 15 years. So it's a huge drop, whilst inflation obviously has gone up.
35. Donc le salaire des médecins consultants a baissé de 35%. Ce qui est considéré comme...
And a couple of points I wanted to make about it. So they're in action again at the moment, the consultants and the juniors, but they don't coordinate their action. So it's a bit random. Some are on strike now, some on strike again. At the moment, they're in a phase of totally ineffective action that the government at the moment is showing every sign of totally ignoring.
Donc leurs actions ne sont pas du tout coordonnées, désolé. Donc en ce moment, les médecins juniors internes sont en grève et les consultants non. Donc ce qui permet au gouvernement du coup d'ignorer leurs demandes. Oui,
and really, it's another plank. They've already defeated the nurses whose unions told them you can't get more than 5%, so they've stopped. And several unions have capitulated, and they're saying the same thing to the medical profession, the different branches. So our radiographers are going to come out on strike in a week's time. They're also being told they'll only get 5%. So every single branch of the NHS employees are involved in industrial action. And there is zero coordination between each of the different branches. You couldn't design like a less effective tactic of struggle.
C'est ce qu'il disait tout à l'heure. Ils ont vaincu les infirmières qui ont accepté une augmentation de 5% seulement alors qu'elles demandaient à la base 15%. Une augmentation en fait liée à l'inflation. Et du coup, le leadership les a forcés à accepter une augmentation de 5%. Et comme il n'y a aucune coordination, la lutte est complètement vaincue.
And you know, the main thing that they're going to hit the consultants in particular with is, you already get so much money, how dare you ask for more money? But if you think about it, it's exactly what they say to tube drivers. You know? I keep on drawing this parallel because there are a branch of skilled workers, many within the country, who have higher pay than average. But they like to individualize attack and destroy solidarity between all workers in this way.
Donc ils répondent aux docteurs, aux médecins qui sont déjà surpayés, qui sont privilégiés. Et donc comme on ose-t-il demander plus, et c'est de la même façon qu'ils traitent les conducteurs de train qui demandent des augmentations.
I say we're like tube drivers. There of course is a difference. I once had a tree surgeon who came to see me in clinic, and I said, God, you guys get paid more than us. And he goes, ha ha, I know. And the best thing about it is I had a 6-week course back in 1974, and I've been taking £1,000 a day ever since. And so there is a difference. A tube driver will take about 6 weeks to train, and a consultant doctor takes about 15 to 20 years to train.
Donc, il avait l'habitude d'avoir un ami qui travaillait en clinique et qui lui disait mais comment ça qui était mieux payé que lui. Sorry, I don't think I get all the points you made.
Don't worry.
He was just moaning about how long it takes to
But the bottom line is that the same thing is happening across every branch of the workforce. We're encouraged to think very individually, not to think collectively. But the reality is, inflation and decreased wages are robbing us all. Increased cost of living is robbing us all. And in particular for the NHS, all of the grades of pay have been eroded to the point that they're going to become profitable to operate in the private sector. So it's a key plank of their privatisation of the whole service is to cheapen labour across the board. And certainly at the lower end of the scale of the NHS, you've got people who are regularly, you've got a large number of our staff who subsist on food banks.
Okay. Donc, la même chose se passe dans toutes les branches professionnelles où on essaie de diminuer leur salaire. Et avec l'inflation, même si on est médecin, on se retrouve quand même face à des difficultés. Et aujourd'hui, la plupart des travailleurs de la branche médicale font appel aux restos du cœur. Ont besoin des restos du cœur pour pouvoir survivre.
This was meant to be just a brief background to the only question I really have. And to me, if you really want to look back at effective trade union struggle in the UK, you have to look at the Clydeside workers and the shop stewards movement of the 1920s and the war period. And they knew very well to be effective, you had to use the organised combined power of the working class, coordinate industrial action. If one factory went on dispute, they held meetings in the evening and they expanded that across the whole sector and sometimes across the whole city and sometimes across the whole nation. And they escalated very quickly to the point that the bosses were drawn to the table and they conceded demands, sometimes small demands, about half an hour on a day, about work breaks, going into struggle for the working class, organising them in such a way that they were effective, that they threatened the profits of the capitalists. The capitalists were forced to make a concession quickly to restore profitability of their industry, and then you showed the working class through this action the benefit of unionisation, that if you win, people want to be unionised. People want to be involved in the struggle because it's actually inspiring to see your collective power and to start to win concessions.
Donc dans les années 70, ils pouvaient organiser rapidement et faire céder les patrons car ils avaient la capacité d'organiser des grèves intersyndicales. Et la 90s?
No, not the 70s. We're talking World War I and the 1920s.
1920s, okay, sorry. Dans les années 20, après la guerre, ils pouvaient organiser des faire céder.
So I guess that's what I think. And if you see from that point on, why were they effective now and not later? Ironically, it was the working class who, in their desire to fight anti-union legislation, who said we must have an organisation that represents us not only in the workplace, but politically. And what did they come out of that? I'm afraid at the first Congress of the Labour Party, when they were changing the Labour Representation Committee into the Labour Party, they explicitly rejected the idea of having an organisation that would recognise class war and fight for power of the working class. Instead, they would have an organisation to represent the interests of workers in Parliament. So they limited themselves to the confines of the bourgeois democratic system from the outset. And more particularly, I mean, all of this was triggered really because I saw a tweet recently in which Labour Party people are saying, let's get Keir Starmer in, we'll get the Labour Party in, and we'll repeal anti-trade union legislation. And so you can see the way in which the law has been used to limit, workers' ability to strike and their ability to win strikes, their ability to expand in the miners' strike, flying pickets, expanding the strike from pit to pit to pit across the industry was sabotaged. The Labour Party played a key role in stopping other unions from coming out in solidarity action. That's illegal. We can't do it. We put our funds at stake. What are we going to do with our pension investment? We've got a multi-billion portfolio we've got to protect. How can we come into conflict with the state? So we've switched from being the militant representatives of workers in struggle facilitating their victory. The trade union movement connected with the Labour Party became a mechanism of state control of the working class, keeping them in their place, keeping their wages low, which is actually precisely what we're told was bad about fascist unions under the aegis of Hitler and Mussolini. It's of course a great unionisation, but they worked as parts of the state to suppress labour. But what have we actually got? From the Labour Party and its history of struggle, we've got a great organisation which coordinates with the state to suppress workers, keep them low paid, and keep their limits of even their proposition. What can we achieve within the narrow horizons of bourgeois law, i.e. to keep them wage slaves? So I guess for me, what we need to do most of all is to get to the point where the workers can organise small victories and start to draw working class back into class struggle. And that to me seems the most obvious way around anti-union laws. I wonder what you think.
I have a question for Alexander.
Yes, great.
Possible. Just quick. Basically, we see the strikes as a disruption, but immediately the organization, the system creates plan B, and the strike became less effective through the days. On the other hand, as Paige has mentioned, we have a strike for different organizations, different unions, etc., all the ones that without any coordination and therefore less effective. My question is, what are the limitations for a general strike? If you can develop the idea why all these strikes that are separated and not become in one flow and one big river that can illuminate us.
Break for Eleanor.
Okay, she understood the question.
Okay.
Well, the TUC in 2012 passed a motion which agreed to investigate the practicalities of a general strike. And the investigation's been going on for 11 years. And they haven't come up with a conclusion yet.
We'll get back to you.
The answer's in the post. But more seriously, why do all these strikes remain fragmented and not put together? Because the leadership doesn't want them put together. Yeah. That's the reason why. They know very well that if you suddenly put together all the health unions going out in conjunction, to draw on what Ranjit was just saying, then that would present a serious problem. Or if, for instance, we broadened out that struggle and had, so we say, several other unions who had disputes striking, but also adding into their demands, the unofficial or unofficially, a defence of the National Health Service, that would be hugely popular with the wider population as well. So this comes back to what we were saying about gatekeepers. The trade union leaders, the reason why that this doesn't happen, why even when we had the coordinated public sector strikes of 2011, when we had that one day on November the 30th, 2011, where millions of public sector workers came out, trade union leaders capitulated the next week. Because, again, they're more afraid of workers escalating the struggle, of learning about their power in struggle, than they are losing to the government. Because they're not losing, we are. And the point about it is that when it comes to the future struggles, we should be working at the grassroots level to make sure that people, first of all, demand unified action from their leaders, to go to their leaders at the branch and the regional level and say we must have coordinated action across all of our different industrial sectors, and to broaden out the demands to make social demands, to make defence of the NHS part of the popularised as a demand, so that when people go on strike, they're also thinking about that, they're actively organising around that. We have to break out of the silo that the law and years of defeat has put us in. Otherwise, the government's going to pick us off one by one by one.
Again, before I open up back to the audience, a couple of things that jumped out at me from what's come from this part of the conversation. The first one is this strategy of divide and rule. How many unions are in each sector is quite a significant question we should ask ourselves. Quite often it shows you how important that sector is, how big it is, how strong its workforce would be if it was unified.
Okay, so le camarade disait.
Oui, c'est génial.
Ok, c'est ça. Ok. Donc ils utilisent très bien la technique de diviser pour mieux régner.
In each sector, we see always at least two unions, at least two.
Donc, okay.
Transport workers, there's 5 or 6. Just train drivers, there's about 3. Just train drivers, there are 3. If you think what a small number of train drivers there are, you see how significant a workforce they are. 3 unions. And in the NHS, 12.
Wow.
No, I found it out quite recently myself. Always knew there was a few. 12 unions representing people who work in the NHS.
And then there'll be those subcontracted out workers who don't have any union at all.
Who don't have a union at all. So this is something we should really understand.
Yeah.
And the other point that comes out to me again that I think needs underlining, and that's why I keep interrupting, sorry, comrades, the dangers of the professionalisation of working class organisation.
Donc elle veut mettre en lumière le danger de la professionnalisation des organisations travailleuses.
Whether it's our political parties or our trade unions, very often we end up with the same result.
Que ce soit les partis politiques ou les unions, on finit toujours avec le même résultat.
We have good revolutionaries, good class fighters turned into bureaucrats.
On a tendance à finir avec des bureaucrates qui étaient à la base des bons.
And machines who develop their own logic.
Et des machines, d'accord.
And the logic is to maintain the machine. It stops being the logic of beating the enemy, the logic of winning the class war, the logic of arriving at socialism, making the revolution. It's the object is just to keep this machine going that we've built and we're so proud of. And look how far we've come. We've got this machine. We must keep the machine. But the machine is part of the status quo. So what they actually have is a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and their position within the status quo as permanent oppositionists.
Yeah.
Respected, recognised, paid, professional. It's a status quo position. And it's the opposite of what these organisations were founded for. But this is very much inherent in creating a paid workforce for the working class struggle in conditions of capitalism. And something I think we should pay attention to and think about as our struggle heats up once again. And we think about how do we create structures that can maintain militancy and actually keep leaders who will guide the struggle in a way that's aimed at winning and not simply at maintaining a position of leadership.
Avec la nouvelle montée du mouvement, on doit se poser la question de construire des organisations vraiment militantes et qui vont guider les masses travailleuses vers la victoire, plutôt que les maintenir dans le même système.
Any more from the floor? Questions, contributions?
Juste...
My question is, well, it was sort of answered actually with the rest of the conversation, but when you said, we talk about organised, they actually had an organised block strike that was proposed, and everyone got cold feet and thought, no, we can't possibly do this, and so and then which completely defeated the position you're all in. But what I wanted to ask at the time was, do you think that was because of the profession? Would it have been the same had it been train drivers or whatever? Is that sense of responsibility to the was your bluff called, were the health workers at that time, was their bluff called? But the point is, would they now go for that strike, that all-right strike?
Thanks, Lucy. I thought it was taking long enough. But so I think this is one of the other biggest obstacles to successful action within the health sector, is that we're all ethically driven, and quite rightly so, by a love of our job and care for the patient, right? So everything is basically orientated towards caring for the sick, caring for the needy. It's like a valuable social profession. That's part of everyone's status. If you work as a receptionist in the NHS, you feel proud that you're serving the community and helping the people. If you work as a nurse, you feel very proud of the job that you do. You put up with a certain amount of hardship, and it's almost like a point of pride. We don't do this for the money. You couldn't pay us for what we do. And even doctors, even ones who have private practice, basically are still governed by that ethical consideration. As you get to the more high-paid sectors, they're also governed by a consideration that, it pays them more to maximise their work than maximise their, strike action and destructive nature. They think they can bargain, professionally manoeuvre, or just expand the amount of work they do get into the private sector. They'll get more money that way. So they're conflicting things that stop us from working. At a certain point, people have got to the point now where they say, look, the service itself is broken. They do feel that if you pay people low enough, if you don't pay the staff in the NHS, there's no NHS. So retention is a real problem, particularly for middle and low paid, grades, professions. For nurses, there's a huge retention problem, because if you work as a nurse in London, you can't afford to live in London. You can barely afford to rent a place. You can't afford to bring up a family. If you go through any social hardship at all, you've gone beyond the breadline. You're on food banks, which is why that's a common and true story. And I've certainly known nurses who lived in London but commuted from somewhere near Luton because it was a place they could afford a tiny, brand new box home, one up, one down. I can afford that, just about get on the housing ladder, and you're in and out travelling. So, but that's not, so if...
Elle demandait en fait quel est le plus, parce qu'en ce moment il y a une grève des médecins et tout. Elle demandait quel était le plus grand obstacle par rapport à ça pour permettre la victoire. Donc elle disait que les médecins sont guidés par l'amour de leur profession et le désir d'aider leurs patients. Il y a une considération éthique très forte, et donc de la simple réceptionniste au médecin les plus gradés. Les gens sont très fiers de travailler dans le service médical. Toutefois, ils ont quand même des difficultés financières. Donc les infirmières, par exemple, ont du mal à vivre à Londres et doivent voyager très loin.
But also there's tremendous public support for the National Health Service, even now when it's being deliberately broken and there's massive waiting lists and there's discontent. People's experiences, they need it, they depend it, they love it, they'll do anything to support it. That's the general population. So it's very important for health unions when they strike to say very directly there's a link between what we're striking for and saving the service.
Donc c'est très important pour ces unions de tracer une ligne entre les raisons pour lesquelles ils grèvent et le bon fonctionnement du service.
So it's, and everyone feels at that breaking point that that's basically what they're striking about. It's like a existential issue for the profession, whether it's doctors or nurses or radiographers. They all feel that way.
Donc ils sentent tous qu'il y a vraiment un besoin urgent de partir en grève.
Normally what's lacking is that communication from the leadership of the unions to the public and their coordination and messaging to their own union. They don't do a lot of organising work. They don't speak to their members. You know, it's almost like they put out a ballot, everyone supports that, and that's it. That was your role. And they'll say, go to a picket. Well, people don't like going to pickets. They don't know why they're going. There's no meeting. They're not discussing how to handle the press. They see the press. They see themselves being attacked. They feel a bit awkward about it. And they just, you know, even though something like 87% of the BMA, for example, voted for industrial action, turnout in some places has been like in the 20s to 30s.
To the pickets?
Yeah, not to the pickets, no. Turnout as in people who declared themselves as striking. They're not even sure exactly, the figures are not sure who was striking, who wasn't, because people are encouraged to maintain the service all the time. So they're disorganised by the management, but they're not organised by the union. So it's possible to have a successful action. It needs the union to act as a union, to fight, to win, to take the profession with them and to communicate with the public. And that's what's just very lacking. It's what me feels. I look at the action, I see, well, it's not going to work. I can see my own colleagues who feel, you know, the justice of their cause, totally shamefaced about it and demoralised and disorganised, and without any decent arguments to muster. So, you know, it's fighting to lose from the outset. Usually Rishi Sunak, you guys are going to get 6%. After one, actually now you've not negotiated, you're going to get 5%. He's coming out like a second-hand car dealer. He doesn't give a damn whether, you know, the NHS functions for us or not, because they're deliberately destroying the service. And so if you strike to save the service, you're attacked as the people who are disrupting, or you're causing terrible hardship. They never talk about the way they're running down the service or the millions on waiting lists, unless it's to say, well, what we should do is push people out to the independent sector where, you know, we might have some interest and you make more money. So there's a constant pressure of privatisation from Labour and Tory, unspoken, whilst our actual, you know, professions are themselves uneducated about what's happening. They don't know. And then when things get bad enough, they feel the service is collapsing, they want to strike. The strike is totally mishandled and mismanaged. That's what we've got. So it's possible to win. It's not just the profession, it's the way it's conducted.
We're talking about a crisis of leadership, aren't we? An absence of real leadership.
Est-ce que je peux dire juste... Enfin, alors, j'ai pas tout compris de ce qui a été dit, donc j'espère que ça va pas...
Tu veux que je te fasse?
Non, mais de ce qui a été dit en règle générale. Mais juste sur la question, enfin, il me semble que le camarade posait la question de pourquoi est-ce que finalement les grèves sont localisées et qu'il n'y a pas de mouvement de grève générale. Nous, c'est une question, justement, il y avait ça.
Je vais juste traduire ce que je viens de dire.
D'accord.
She would like to answer the question on why the movement is dispersed instead of being united and how a general strikes.
C'est une question qui est importante pour nous et qu'on doit se poser parce que précisément le mouvement qu'on vient de connaître a été un mouvement où il y a eu des journées de grève dans certains secteurs très particuliers, mais globalement n'a pas été un mouvement de grève massif, malgré les appels à un mouvement de grève massif.
It's a very important question because the reform movement the pension reform movement that we just had was a very localized movement instead of being a nationally organized one.
Et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles on a perdu aussi.
And it's clearly one of the reasons we lost.
Et selon moi, il y a un certain nombre de raisons qui sont liées à la modification aussi des conditions matérielles d'existence et des conditions matérielles de travail des individus dans la société. La première, ça a toujours été le cas, c'est que en fait aujourd'hui les gens donc il y a une inflation énorme, une énorme crise économique et les gens vraiment concrètement n'ont plus d'argent du tout. Donc perdre 1 ou 2 ou 3 journées de salaire, ça devient extrêmement compliqué.
And for me, it's linked to a change in the material condition of people, the impoverishment of the working class. Workers cannot afford to go on strike more than a few days.
Ça a toujours été le cas dans l'histoire. Donc ça peut pas être suffisant, ça peut pas être une justification. La deuxième chose aussi, c'est la précarisation du travail. C'est-à-dire que finalement, quand vous êtes un travailleur précaire, la question qui se pose, ce n'est pas de perdre le salaire d'une journée ou de 2 journées ou d'une semaine ou de 10 jours, c'est de perdre votre travail. Et quand vous avez en fait une énorme pression sur les chômeurs et que vous avez 3 millions de chômeurs dans un pays, en France c'est le cas, et que en plus un certain nombre de lois sont passées pour réprimer les chômeurs en priorité par rapport aux autres travailleurs, c'est-à-dire leur réduire en fait finalement leurs allocations chômage, ça fait très très peur.
Yes. So the other reason is the precarization of work. So workers are working for less and less wages, and they're completely afraid to lose their job because there is a very strong repression against unemployed people that have benefit from the state, but they are treated as outlaws. They have a strong attacks against them to force them to go back to the forced work. To the workforce, sorry.
Mais je pense que la raison, elle est plus profonde que ça aussi, et elle est liée justement à la perte de vision globale de la production que beaucoup de travailleurs n'ont plus, justement. C'est que... Tu veux traduire?
So the working class has also lost the link they had with the production. So we're having, je veux dire, une économie de service.
Il y a ça, mais pas seulement. C'est aussi la manière dont la production... Enfin, il n'y a plus de vision globale de comment fonctionne la production.
They don't know how production generally works now.
So they've lost their overview of how production works.
Ils l'ont perdu parce que aussi, il y a... alors, la division du travail, elle est pas récente. Je veux dire, Marx l'avait bien analysé. Pour autant, nous, ce qu'on constate en France, c'est qu'il y a une division, y compris du travail au niveau géographique. Avant, il y avait l'usine, donc on avait, je veux dire, il y en avait un qui faisait ça, un qui faisait ça, un qui faisait ça, un qui faisait ça. Pour autant, ils étaient tous dans un même environnement. Aujourd'hui, en fait, on voit qu'une des stratégies du capital, ça a été justement de diviser, y compris géographiquement, les individus, qui du coup en perdent, en fait, sont vraiment monotâches, mais dans des espaces différents. Je veux dire, le télétravail, par exemple, aujourd'hui, qui est quelque chose qui est très important, enfin, a amplifié ce phénomène. Donc, en fait, les individus se disent, mais moi, je vais faire grève. Mais à quoi ça sert? Puisque finalement, je vais rien bloquer du tout. Mais parce qu'ils n'ont pas conscience d'être quand même un maillon indispensable dans la chaîne. D'où l'idée de travailler... à la coordination et à faire prendre conscience que la coordination, c'est pas seulement pour taper plus fort, mais c'est aussi parce que finalement, la production elle-même, c'est une chaîne. Et que du coup, si vous voulez arrêter... Je prends par exemple la grève du déchet. Ouais. Pardon.
C'est difficile. So another reason is division of labor, which we are aware of since the work of Marx. But I also think that today there is a geographical division. Workers are isolated from each other. The work is more and more. They're more and more isolated from each other, and they have a monotask to execute, and that's it. And also, a lot of people are working from home, so they don't feel the need to go on strike or the importance of going on strike, and they are not aware of their place in the production chain. So they don't think that if they go on strike, it's gonna have any impact of any kind of sort.
Donc, par exemple, dans le domaine du déchet, on a eu une grosse grève des éboueurs récemment, mais une des stratégies du patronat et du gouvernement a été de remplacer notamment les fonctionnaires qui travaillent pour les territorialités, enfin pour les collectivités territoriales, par des boîtes privées. Donc en fait, les fonctionnaires disent eux-mêmes, mais pourquoi est-ce que je vais me mettre en grève si finalement mon travail va être réalisé par quelqu'un d'autre? Du coup, d'où la nécessité de créer des grèves par secteur et par chaîne. Et donc pour ça, il faut l'identifier. Donc il faut analyser aussi la manière dont, très très concrètement, la production a lieu à un moment donné X de l'histoire. Voilà.
Private workers. So recently we had a huge strike in the wastage industry, and because yes, a huge strike in the council were hiring private workers to replace the beanmen, and the beanmen were threatened by that and didn't see the purpose of going on strike if they could be easily replaced by someone else.
Donc ce qu'ils ont trouvé comme solution, c'est qu'en fait ils ont fait un énorme travail à la fois pour mettre en grève les éboueurs fonctionnaires, aller dans les entreprises privées, notamment Veolia, Suez, qui s'occupent aussi de la branche déchets, pour mettre en grève ces travailleurs-là, mettre en grève les incinérateurs, mettre en grève le transport de déchets, et à cette condition-là, de mettre en grève tous ces secteurs-là en même temps, c'était un travail spécifique, ça a été volontairement fait, là, il n'y a plus aucun déchet qui bouge et vous avez des poubelles partout dans Paris.
So their solution was to organize every different branches of the wastage industry to go on strike at the same time to completely paralyze Paris.
Yeah.
Mais pour ça, il a fallu déjà faire un travail préparatoire d'identification des différentes entreprises qui s'occupaient de cette question-là, qui était le sous-traitant qui déplaçait la poubelle de tel endroit à tel endroit, et donc une connaissance concrète en fait de la production.
Yeah. So they had to really do a work of knowing every single branch and every single outsourced company that was working in this vast industry to know how to coordinate the action.
Et pour revenir au sujet, c'est que c'était cette absence d'analyse de la production concrètement à un instant T de l'histoire qui fait qu'aujourd'hui les travailleurs se disent ça ne sert à rien que je me mette en grève, parce qu'ils n'ont pas conscience en fait que si ils sont un maillon et que ce maillon, si on l'arrête, si on trouve le bon moment où ce maillon doit s'arrêter, il a un impact. Voilà. D'où le fait, si je peux juste me permettre, ce que Olivier Matteux disait quand il disait voilà, on comprend que vous ne pouvez pas vous mettre en grève toute la journée, mais identifiez le moment dans votre journée de travail où vous savez que si vous ne réalisez pas cet acte, vous allez bloquer votre entreprise. Ça peut être envoyer un mail qui doit être envoyé. Ça 15 minutes de grève dans votre journée, vous perdez 15 minutes de travail. Mais c'est le mail qui devait être envoyé et qui n'a pas été envoyé, donc ça a bloqué une semaine de travail.
Ok.
Trouver des solutions alternatives.
So, yes. The lack of understanding of how the production work in its globality is what is restraining the workers today, and they are really doing this job of trying to link all the different chains together. Links together, and make them work as a unite, basically when they're striking. And Olivier Matteux has a very good advice, and he told them try to identify a moment during the day where the work you're meant to do will paralyze the activity, will cause trouble for your even if it's a single task, but if it's like sending an email, but if this email is not sent, then it stops productivity. Mm-hmm. So you have to identify that, and that's a way of striking as well, and a direct action.
Very nice, very interesting. Thank you. These are the kind of things we don't hear our trade union leaders talking about, aren't they? And that these are the conversations we actually need to be having. How do you work out how to be effective? How do we wage this struggle in a meaningful way? I'm going to wrap up in a second. First, I'm going to ask Alex if you have anything more to add.
Well, just to go back to the point about the union movement remaining divided and not acting together, solidarity action was very carefully made illegal from the 1980s onwards. So it used to be, I had this lecturer at university who'd been a machine tool worker in the 70s, and he told me stories about walking out of his plant in solidarity with the Chilean workers who were being repressed by Pinochet because the plant was supplying Hawk fighter jets to the Pinochet regime. And that, of course, is now illegal. And not only is it illegal, they've worked very hard to make sure that all workers have been atomised to the point where the legal framework essentially becomes your consciousness. Unless you have a very specific identifiable dispute, you're not allowed to go on strike. And yet, every year at the union congresses, there's this social and economic section where we get passed every year motions on save the NHS, protect public transport, etc., etc., etc. They go in the file, the leadership says, we will take this up with the TUC. The TUC says, that's nice, and no one does anything. Now, one of the what we need to get around, and I think this is the general theme emerging from our discussion, is this legally imposed framework which institutionalizes atomization and division. And we need to look at the social demands of the class, the social demands like having access to a healthcare system that works and is available for them when they need it, to having decent wages across the board, to having decent housing, because there's a housing bill motions passed every year at conferences that nobody does anything about. So those social cross-class demands that go across the entire working class, these now need to be popularised as demands to mobilise around. There needs to be a full spectrum of demands being put forward, not just narrow wage claims anymore, though that would be a start. We have to broaden this struggle out towards the entire state of life that the working class has in this country and all the things that are being taken away from us in this relentless class war from the capitalist class who want to take back every concession that's ever been made to us.
So, comrades, just in wrapping up the meeting, I want to come back to a few key points. And I think the first thing we have to keep bringing ourselves back to, and it's come out of this discussion several times, is why do our struggles always seem to fail? And there are certain key elements to the answer to that. One of them has been highlighted in this meeting several times. It's the link to the Labour Party and the absolute control that the parliamentary Labour Party has over the entire mechanism of the TUC, the rest of the Labour Party, the union leaderships, and down through all the union committees. And, you know, all of us who've sat on union committees or tried to get jobs as union workers can tell stories about how your career as a unionist will prosper or fail depending on your affiliation to the Labour Party. That's number one. Number two is, again, this absolute civility before the law and this constant using of the law, a legal environment that has been specifically created to make sure that a strike cannot be effective within its terms. Right? That's an environment that's been precisely designed in this country. And we've watched it be instituted over the last 4 decades. Right? And it's made it, as Alex said, it's made it so that, you know, according to the law, the only people allowed to be in dispute are those directly affected, and the way that is determined, again, it's sort of up to the ruling class to tell you who's affected, you know, and the trade union bureaucracy has become the lieutenants of the ruling class, telling us who's affected and who isn't, not allowing members of the same union to communicate with one another or to support one another. What on earth is the point of Unite telling you it's Britain's biggest union? But when you go on a dispute with Unite, you're not even allowed to tell the people in a branch next door about your dispute. It's not their dispute, it's your dispute. Never mind mobilise them, you know. Never mind, you know, actually call on the power of you. Imagine if some nurses in dispute or some cleaners in dispute somewhere were unionised by Unite, and Unite took the advice of, or followed the example of the unionists Ranjit was telling us about in the Clydeside in 1918, 1919, who would have pulled out the whole of the Clydeside to pull those employers onto the negotiating table like that. Imagine if some cleaners in a school organised by Unite went to leadership and said, you know, they're treating us like dirt and they won't talk to us, and Unite said, right, the union's coming out. Well, then it would be worth something, wouldn't it, to be in Britain's biggest union? What does it mean to workers today to be in Britain's biggest union? Britain's best bureaucracy for ignoring the strikes of its poor members who just pay their dues for absolutely nothing. And of course, what we talked about was also the institutionalized bureaucracies. I highlighted the point earlier, but, they're trained in enforcing these things. They're trained in enforcing the labour link. They're trained in enforcing civility before the law. They're well rewarded for carrying out their training. It's very timely that our party is producing a small pamphlet on social democracy.
Battery's going to go flat in about 2 minutes.
Okay. And we have to notice that even in France, we continue to fight the same battles, right? So one of the jobs of communists is not only to help trade unionists to fight effectively, but to teach them, to teach them that the trade union struggle, even waged in the most effective way, it cannot be the end of our story. So just briefly, I want to remind everybody, we have brought out this pamphlet, the Manifesto for the Crisis. This is our party's contribution to what's happening. If you look through the contents of this, it tells you exactly what we want to say to people. Number one, what's the problem with the system? Why are we in this crisis? Number two, where did inflation come from? What does it mean, this cost of living crisis? Number three, what's happening to the workers in the course of this struggle? Number four, how is it connected to the drive to war? We've not talked about that today, but it's a very essential point to understand for the working class. And number five, what would a real fight back actually look like? And we have model motions on all these most fundamental questions. A model motion on breaking the link with labour. A model motion on defying the anti-union laws and not being servile to them. A model motion on the measures needed right now today to help workers survive in the face of the most brutal attack on their working conditions and their standard of living, their pay and everything that's happening to them. And a model motion on refusing to cooperate any longer with the imperialist war drive.